The auctioneer's gavel came down like a judge's sentence, and the man who'd just bought Georgina Fraser's future didn't even look up from lighting his cigar. "Sold," said Denton Greer, the auctioneer, wiping sweat from his jowls with a handkerchief already ruined by the heat. "Lot Fortin to Mr. Beaumont for $32. $32. That was what 18 years of living came to in Sweetwater Creek, Texas, on the last Thursday of July, 1873. Georgina stood on the wooden platform they'd built outside the land office, boards rough enough to splinter through her worn boot soles, and she did not cry. She'd made herself a promise that morning while her sisters were still sleeping. Whatever happened, she would not give this town the pleasure of her tears. But her hands, clasped behind her back, were shaking badly enough that she could feel her own knuckles trembling against each other. If you've ever wondered how much a person's dignity is worth when the world stops caring, stay with us. This is that story. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. And drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that auction block. The debt had been their father's, but the shame had landed on all three of them equally. Edmund Fraser had been many things in his 51 years. A dreamer, a storyteller, a man who could talk a crow out of a cornfield, but he had never been careful with money. By the time his heart gave out in the spring of 1873, he had borrowed against the farm twice, signed promissory notes with 3 different men in town, and left his daughters with a house that technically belonged to someone else and a last name that, in Sweetwater Creek, now meant something close to reckless. The creditors came fast, faster than the neighbors with their sympathy casseroles and their sideways glances. Grace, the eldest at 22, had tried to negotiate. She'd put on her best dress, the brown wool one with the white collar, the one she wore to church and to funerals, and walked into the offices of 2 different lawyers and a banker named Aldous Price. She'd laid out what she thought was a reasonable proposal: give them 18 months, let her manage the farm properly, and she'd pay back every cent with interest. Price had listened with his hands folded on his desk, and then told her, gently but with the finality of a man who had made this speech many times, that the property had already been claimed by a Mr. Harold Beaumont under the terms of the original note their father had signed 4 years prior. The farm wasn't theirs to negotiate with. And as for the rest of the debts, the labor owed to Richfield and Sons, the unpaid feed account, those creditors had already petitioned the county. Petitioned for what? Grace had asked. Price had the decency to look at his hands when he answered. For the sisters to be auctioned as contracted laborers, to recover what's owed. Grace had stood very still for a long moment. Then she'd said, "We are not livestock, Mr. Price." And Price had said, "No, ma'am, but the law doesn't see much difference between a debt and a debt." So here they were. The auction had started at 8 in the morning with household goods, what little the Fraser girls had managed to keep after the house was emptied. A quilt their mother had made, a cast-iron pot, 3 chairs that had belonged to their grandmother. Georgina had watched each item go with the particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself loudly, just sits behind your breastbone like a stone you can't swallow and can't put down. Then the auctioneer had called for the contracted labor lots, and Grace had reached over and taken Georgina's hand so hard it hurt. They'd separated them immediately. That was what broke something in Georgina. Not the platform, not the crowd of men standing in the dust looking them over like they were horses at a county fair. It was the way the auctioneer's men just stepped between the 3 sisters like it was nothing, like separating a family was a logistical task, the same as sorting crates. "Grace," Georgina had started. "Don't," Grace said. Her voice was flat, controlled. "Don't let them see." Eliza, the youngest at 15, said nothing. She'd gone very pale and very quiet, which was worse than crying would have been. Georgina was called up first because she was the middle sister, and the auctioneer seemed to be working through the lots in some arbitrary order that made sense only to him. She climbed the 3 wooden steps to the platform and stood in the full blast of the morning sun and looked out at the crowd. She recognized some of the faces. She'd gone to school with a few of the men's sons. She'd bought flour at Hargrove's Dry Goods. She'd sat 3 pews behind the Dalloway family every Sunday for years. And now those same people stood in the dirt street with their hands in their pockets or their thumbs hooked in their belts, and not one of them, not a single one, looked like they were troubled by what they were watching. That was when Harold Beaumont stepped forward. He was a wide man, thick through the chest and neck, with small eyes that sat too close together in a broad red face. He wore a good suit, which on him looked less like respectability and more like a threat dressed up for company. He chewed on a toothpick and studied Georgina with the particular focused attention of a man evaluating something he already intends to purchase. "I'll start at 20, he said. His voice carried easily. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. Men like Beaumont never needed to raise their voices because the world had always made space for them. No one countered. Why would they? Beaumont owned the feed store, the livery, and 2 of the town councilmen. Countering Harold Beaumont on anything in Sweetwater Creek was a social calculation most men weren't willing to make. 25, said someone near the back, and the crowd shifted to look. It was a man named Terrence Lyle, a rancher from 2 counties over who Georgina didn't know. He had the weathered look of a man who spent most of his life outdoors and the hungry look of a man who'd recently been alone too long. He wasn't bidding out of charity. The way he was looking at her made that clear enough. Beaumont turned and looked at Lyle with the absolute calm of someone who'd never once had to worry about losing. 30, he said. Lyle hesitated. 31. 32. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Georgina had ever heard. She kept her eyes fixed on a point just above the crowd's heads, a gap between the roof of the land office and the blue-white Texas sky. And she breathed very carefully, counting her breaths the way her mother had taught her when she was small and the world felt too large and too indifferent. "Sold," said Denton Greer, "lot 14, to Mr. Beaumont for $32. Beaumont's mouth curved around his toothpick. He still didn't look up at her directly. He was already reaching into his coat for his money. Georgina descended the platform steps on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. One of the auctioneer's men, a young fellow who couldn't meet her eyes, took her by the elbow and directed her to stand to the left of the platform, away from where Grace and Eliza were waiting. Away from them. 20 feet of packed dirt between her and her sisters, and it might as well have been 20 miles. Grace was watching her. Georgina could feel it. She didn't look over because if she did, she would lose the promise she'd made herself, and then all of this, all of it, would happen while she was weeping, and she refused to give Sweetwater Creek that. The auctioneer called Grace's lot next. Beaumont bid again, almost reflexively, because that was what men like Beaumont did. They accumulated. Grace stood on the platform with her spine straight and her chin level and her expression so carefully blank that Georgina felt a pulse of painful pride, because that was her sister. That was Grace, who had walked into a lawyer's office in her best dress and tried to save them all through sheer force of organized argument and lost anyway, and was still not going to let anyone see her bleed. Bidding for Grace went higher. She was older, more visibly capable, someone a household might actually find useful, and in the end, Beaumont paid $40. His mouth never changed expression. He just kept his eyes on the platform and kept his hand going up like it was a reflex, like this was simply a morning of routine business. When they called Eliza's lot, Georgina finally looked at her youngest sister and had to look away just as fast. Eliza was 15. She was thin-wristed and still had the roundness in her face that children carry before the world takes it from them. She stood on the platform and her lower lip was pressed so hard against her upper one that it had gone white, and her hands were fists at her sides, and she was the bravest and most heartbreaking thing Georgina had ever seen. Beaumont started the bidding at 15. And then, from the far end of the street, a horse came through the crowd at a walk that said its rider wasn't in a hurry and wasn't apologizing for arriving late either. The crowd parted the way crowds do when they sense something is about to happen and can't quite decide yet whether to be frightened or curious. The horse was a big gray animal, well kept, moving with the easy authority of a horse that had been ridden hard for years and had never once been treated badly. Its rider was a lean man in a dusty coat, perhaps 35, with a hat pulled low and a face that, even from a distance, gave away very little. He stopped at the edge of the crowd and looked at the platform, and then at the auctioneer, and then at the 3 women, 2 on the ground, 1 still standing up there in the sun, and something shifted in his expression. Something that wasn't sentimentality and wasn't shock, but was very close to a decision being made. "What's the current lot?" he asked. His voice was quiet enough that only the nearest people should have been able to hear it, but the crowd had gone oddly still, and it carried. Denton Greer squinted at him. Lot 16, Eliza Frazier, $15 opening. The stranger said, "I'll take all three." The crowd didn't make a sound for a moment. Then it erupted in the particular confused murmur of people processing something that doesn't fit the expected shape of the morning. Beaumont turned from the platform to look at the man on the gray horse. His toothpick had gone still. "This isn't how lots work," he said. "I know how lots work," the stranger said. He'd walked his horse a few steps closer. He still hadn't raised his voice. "I'm not asking how lots work, I'm making an offer." Greer said, "Mister, I don't know who you are, but—" "Caleb Whitmore," the man said. "Circle W Ranch, Holt County. I've got documentation if you need it." That name moved through the crowd differently than the previous murmur. Some people recognized it. Others recognized the recognition on other people's faces and caught the ripple. A few of the older men shifted their weight and exchanged glances. Beaumont said, "Those first two lots are already sold." "Unsell them," Whitmore said. "That's not—" "I'll pay double what you paid." He looked at Beaumont with the same expression a man might use when looking at arithmetic he's already worked out in his head. $144 for all three. That covers your bids, the outstanding debts, and the county's cut. Run the math." Greer was already running it. Georgina could see it on his face, the speed with which money made a man reassess his principles. He looked at his papers. He looked at Beaumont. He looked at the crowd. Beaumont said, "I'm not interested in—" "I'm not talking to you," Whitmore said. He looked directly at Greer. "You're the county representative here. This is a legal transaction. A higher bid supersedes a closed lot if the lot buyer agrees to release it. The statute's clear." He did know how lots worked. Greer turned to Beaumont with the apologetic expression of a man who sees the money and has already chosen a side. "He's not wrong about the statute, Harold." Beaumont's jaw set. He bit down on the toothpick hard enough that it snapped. He looked at Whitmore for a long moment, the kind of look that was not an ending but a postponement. And then he looked at his broken toothpick and dropped it in the dust. "Fine," he said. The word had no give in it at all. Greer cleared his throat and turned to the crowd. Lot 14, 15, and 16, consolidated and reoffered. "Mr. Whitmore? $144, yes?" "Yes," said Whitmore. "Sold." Georgina stood very still in the sun and tried to understand what had just happened. Grace was at her side almost instantly. She'd crossed the 20 feet of dirt without Georgina even registering it, and Grace's hand found her arm, and for a moment the two of them just stood there together while the crowd broke apart around them the way water moves around a stone. Eliza climbed down from the platform on her own. Her fists were still clenched, but some of the white had left her lip. The man on the gray horse dismounted slowly, like someone who'd spent so many hours in a saddle that getting off it required its own deliberate process. He was taller than he'd looked from a distance. He handed his reins to no one, just looped them over the hitching post himself, and walked toward the three sisters with his hat still pulled low. He stopped about 6 feet away. Close enough to talk, far enough that he wasn't crowding them. Grace spoke first, because Grace always spoke first. "What do you want from us?" It was exactly the right question, and Georgina knew it, and she knew Whitmore probably knew it too because he didn't flinch from it and didn't dress it up. "Work," he said. "I run a large operation. I'm short on capable people. You'll be paid fair wages, housed and fed properly, and you'll work off the debt over a term we'll put in writing before we leave this street." He paused. "You can read a contract?" Grace's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes." "Good. So can I. That'll make it simpler." Georgina looked at him, really looked, trying to find the angle, because there had to be one. Men didn't spend $144 out of generosity. Men didn't ride into the middle of someone else's debt auction on a gray horse and upend the morning without wanting something that wasn't covered in the contract. Whitmore met her look with the steadiness of a man who was used to being scrutinized and had long since stopped caring about it in either direction. He wasn't trying to seem trustworthy. He wasn't trying to seem anything. That was either the most honest thing about him or the most dangerous. And standing in the dust outside the Sweetwater Creek land office, with $32 of someone else's claim still metaphorically hanging around her neck, Georgina didn't have the luxury of deciding which. "You could have just bought me," she said. "That was the straightforward transaction." "Yes," he said. "But you didn't." "No." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't evasion, but was choosing words carefully, which was different. Because separating a family to settle a debt is a thing that ought to trouble someone, he said. And it clearly wasn't troubling anyone else this morning. Eliza made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob. She covered her mouth with the back of her hand. Grace said, "Show us the contract." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. Not something he'd written on the ride over. Something that had been written out in proper ink at a proper desk, which meant he'd come to town already knowing what he was going to do, which meant he'd known about the auction before this morning, which meant there was a whole layer of the situation they were only seeing the surface of, and handed it to Grace without ceremony. Grace read it there in the street, in the full sun, with her finger moving slightly along the lines the way people read when they're not performing reading but actually doing it. She read it twice. She handed it to Georgina. Georgina read it. She handed it to Eliza, who was 15 but had been reading since she was 4 and deserved to understand her own circumstances. The terms were what he'd said: fair wages, room and board, a written debt schedule with a fixed end date. There was a clause that said either party could dissolve the arrangement with 30 days' notice and an accounting of the outstanding balance. There was a clause that said the sisters could not be separated or loaned to other parties. There was a clause that said any dispute would be taken to the county court in Holt County, not Sweetwater Creek. It was a real contract. Someone who understood law had written it. Georgina looked up at Whitmore. "You had this drafted before you came here." "Yes." "You knew about the auction." "I heard about it 2 days ago. Rode from the ranch yesterday." "Why?" she asked again, and she meant it differently this time. Not why did you buy us, but why did you care enough to ride a day and a half to be here? His answer was the same, though. Because it was the right thing to do. Which told her almost nothing, and she suspected he knew that, and she suspected he'd said it anyway because it was also true. And some things are both insufficient and accurate at the same time. Grace pulled a pencil from her coat pocket. She had always carried a pencil, even at their lowest point, which was something Georgina had loved about her sister without ever saying so, and said, "I need to add one clause." Whitmore looked at her. "What clause?" "That we retain the right to refuse any work order we deem unsafe or unlawful, in writing." He looked at the paper and then back at Grace with an expression that for just a moment was something close to respect. "Add it," he said. She did. Right there in the street, with people still milling around them and the auctioneer packing up his ledger books, and Harold Beaumont's broad back retreating toward his feed store with the particular rigid quality of a man who was going to find a different way to make someone pay for this morning. They all three signed the contract. Whitmore signed it. He folded it and gave one copy to Grace and kept one for himself. Then he walked back to his horse. "When do we leave?" Georgina asked. "Now," he said. "Unless you have something to collect." She looked at her sisters. They had the clothes they were wearing. They had each other. They had a contract in Grace's coat pocket. They had, between the three of them, exactly nothing else in Sweetwater Creek worth staying for. "No," Georgina said. "We don't." He untied his horse and started walking it toward the edge of town. The sisters fell into step behind him, and the crowd watched them go, and the dust settled, and the morning continued around them the way mornings do. Indifferent, relentless, already moving on to the next thing. But Georgina looked back once, just once, at the auction platform standing empty in the sun, at the 3 wooden steps she'd climbed up and down in the space of an hour, at the town that had known her family for 8 years and had watched this happen without a word of protest. She looked back and she memorized it. Then she turned forward and walked toward whatever Caleb Whitmore's Circle W ranch was going to turn out to be, because forward was the only direction that made any sense now. And she had learned this morning, in the most concrete possible way, that the past was not going to do a single thing to help her. The road out of Sweetwater Creek was long and mostly silent, which suited all of them. Caleb Whitmore rode ahead on the gray horse. Not far ahead, but far enough that the sisters could talk among themselves without feeling watched. Georgina wasn't sure if that was deliberate or just the habit of a man accustomed to traveling alone, but either way she was grateful for it. The space gave Grace room to be anxious without having to hide it, and Grace needed that space badly, though she would never have admitted it. "He rode a day and a half to get there," Grace said, keeping her voice low. She had the contract folded in her coat pocket, and her hand kept going to it, pressing the paper flat against her ribs the way you'd check a wound. That means someone told him. Someone in Sweetwater Creek sent word about the auction. "Does it matter?" Eliza asked. She was walking with her arms crossed, not from cold. The heat was still merciless, but from the particular self-containment of someone who'd had a very bad morning and was holding themselves together through posture alone. "It matters because I want to understand what he gets out of this," Grace said. Georgina said nothing. She was watching the way Whitmore sat in the saddle. Not rigid, not relaxed exactly, but balanced, like a man who'd made a kind of peace with being in motion and hadn't expected stillness for so long that he'd stopped missing it. That told her something, though she couldn't have said precisely what. They traveled through the afternoon. Whitmore stopped once to water the horse at a creek crossing and wordlessly handed back a canteen, which they passed among themselves without comment. He didn't try to make conversation, and after a while Georgina stopped bracing for it. By the time the light turned amber and long, they'd covered enough distance that Sweetwater Creek felt like something that had happened to other people. The landscape had shifted from the flat dust of town into something rougher and more honest. Scrub oak and cedar, red clay hills, the occasional hawk riding a thermal overhead with the extraordinary patience of creatures that have learned to let the wind do most of the work. They camped that night beside a dry wash. Whitmore built a fire without asking for help and without refusing it when Eliza quietly picked up branches and added them to the pile. Grace sat with the contract and read it a third time in the firelight. Georgina watched their employer across the flames and tried to build a picture of him from the available evidence. What she had so far. He prepared for contingencies. The contract proved that. He didn't talk to fill silence, which was rarer than people understood. He'd spent real money without apparent resentment, but he didn't carry himself like a man to whom money meant nothing. He carried himself like a man who understood exactly what things cost, and had decided this particular cost was worth it. He wasn't performing generosity. There was something almost businesslike about the whole transaction, and that was, paradoxically, the thing that reassured her most. "How many people work at the ranch?" Grace asked, without looking up from the contract. Whitmore was looking at the fire. He took a moment before answering that wasn't evasion. It was the pause of someone doing an actual count. "Depends on the season. Right now, maybe 22 adults, 12 children." Grace looked up. "Children?" "Some of the families have children." He picked up a stick and poked at the edge of the fire where a log was settling. "Some of the children came without families." The silence after that had a different texture. "Orphans?" Eliza asked. "Some." He set the stick down. "Runaways. A few who were with families that couldn't keep them anymore for one reason or another. We don't ask a lot of questions about how people got to us. We ask what they can do and what they need." Grace had closed the contract. She was watching him now with the full attention she usually reserved for legal documents and arithmetic she suspected was wrong. "That's an unusual way to run a ranch." "It works," he said, which was not an explanation, and he seemed to know it wasn't, but he didn't elaborate, and after a moment Grace looked back at the fire. Georgina lay awake long after her sisters had fallen asleep, listening to the sounds the Texas dark made. Insects, wind in the scrub, once the distant sound of something larger moving through the brush, and thought about what Whitmore had said. "We don't ask a lot of questions about how people got to us." She turned that over the way you'd turn a stone to see what was underneath it. In the morning, they rode on. The Circle W ranch came into view in the middle of the second afternoon, and it was nothing like what Georgina had been imagining. She'd pictured something on the scale of Whitmore's apparent resources. A grand house, painted fences. The visible architecture of wealth, carefully maintained. What she saw instead was a sprawling, practical collection of structures that looked like they'd been built when needed and added onto without much concern for aesthetics. A main house that was large but plainly kept. 2 long bunkhouses set at angles to each other. A substantial kitchen building with smoke rising from its chimney, despite the heat, a barn, and 3 outbuildings. A garden that was larger than it had any right to be, and clearly the province of someone who took it seriously. And people. More people than Georgina had expected. A woman hanging laundry on a line near the bunkhouse, perhaps 40, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd hung laundry 10,000 times and knew exactly how many seconds each motion should take. 2 men working on a fence line. A cluster of children at the far end of the yard, involved in some argument that appeared to be about a rope. One of the children spotted the approaching horses and let out a yell. Within 30 seconds, several people had emerged from various buildings and were making their way toward the front of the property. Whitmore dismounted at the fence, and a boy of about 12 took the gray horse's reins without being asked, running a hand down the animal's neck and murmuring something to it that made the horse's ear flick in acknowledgement. "That's Joseph," Whitmore said to Georgina, who was watching. "He's been here 2 years. Better with horses than most men I've hired for wages." Joseph didn't seem to hear this, or if he did, he absorbed it without reaction, the way children absorb praise they've been getting regularly enough that it no longer surprises them. The woman from the laundry line arrived first. She was Anglo, with dark gray hair and a face that had been pretty once and was now more interesting, which was usually the better deal. She looked at the three sisters with direct, unhurried appraisal. Not unfriendly, but thorough. "These are the Fraser women," Whitmore said to her. "Grace, Georgina, Eliza, this is Ruth Danby. She manages the household operations." Ruth said, "I was told there might be 3 of you." She looked at Grace first, probably correctly identifying her as the one to address. "We have rooms in the East bunkhouse. Not private, but decent. You'll share with 3 other women." "That's fine," Grace said. "Supper's at 6. If you want to clean up first, I can show you where." She paused. "You eat pork?" "We eat anything," Eliza said, with a feeling that was several weeks of intermittent meals speaking through her. Ruth looked at Eliza with the particular warmth of a woman who recognized genuine hunger and didn't make a production of it. "Good," she said. "Come on, then." She led them toward the east bunkhouse without waiting for Whitmore, who seemed to expect this and went toward the barn. The sisters followed Ruth through the yard, and Georgina took in everything she could. The sound of someone inside the kitchen building working with a knife on a wooden surface. The small kitchen garden tucked against the south wall of the main house. The way the 2 men at the fence line watched them pass without staring, respectful in the specific way of men who'd been told or figured out that staring wasn't welcome here. The east bunkhouse had 6 beds, 3 of which were occupied by the belongings of women who were clearly elsewhere at the moment. The beds were narrow, but real. Actual frames with actual mattresses, not cots. And the room was clean with the aggressive cleanliness of a shared space where someone had decided that tidiness was a non-negotiable social contract. Ruth showed them the washroom. She showed them where extra linens were kept. She gave each of them a towel that had been washed so many times it had gone soft from it, which was one of the small, specific kindnesses that lodges itself in memory, precisely because it costs so little and means so much when you've been having the kind of week that makes you grateful for soft towels. Then she left them alone. Eliza sat down on the nearest bed and put her face in her hands and stayed like that for a long moment. She wasn't crying. Or she was, a little, but quietly, with the private sound of someone who'd decided they were allowed exactly this much and no more. Georgina sat beside her and didn't say anything. Grace stood in the middle of the room looking at the ceiling, which was her thinking posture, the one she'd had since childhood when she'd work out math problems by tilting her head back and staring at whatever was above her. "Okay," Grace said finally. "Okay," Georgina said. "The contract is sound, the terms are honest, the place is real." She lowered her chin. "We see how it goes." It was not the most enthusiastic endorsement of their circumstances, but it was Grace's version of "we're going to be all right," and all 3 of them knew it. The first week was the hardest, in the way that first weeks always are when you're learning a new place's rhythms and everyone around you already knows them. Ruth put Grace to work in the accounting room in the main house almost immediately. The ranch ran on a complicated system of ledgers, wages, supplies, debts, livestock inventory, and whoever had been managing them before had done so with a method that was technically functional but required psychic abilities to follow. Grace sat down with the books on her second morning there and emerged 2 hours later with a look on her face that Georgina recognized as the one she got when confronted with a problem she was already 3/4 of the way to solving. "The supply ledger and the wage ledger have been run separately," she told Georgina that evening. "They should be integrated, and someone's been estimating the feed costs instead of actually calculating them, which means the quarterly figures are off by—" She stopped. "You don't care about this." "I care that you care about it," Georgina said. Grace allowed herself a small smile. "The point is, there's real work here, work that matters." Georgina's own work was less tidy. She was assigned to general ranch labor, split between the garden, the laundry operation, and whatever needed doing on a given day. She'd worked hard before, on their father's farm, but the scale here was different. The Circle W fed 22 adults and 12 children, which meant the garden was not a garden in the gentle domestic sense, but something closer to a serious agricultural enterprise that happened to be behind a house. She learned the names of her bunkhouse roommates. There was Vera, a woman in her mid-30s who'd come to the ranch the previous winter with 2 children and a jaw that had healed wrong from being broken, though no one said this directly. Josephine, called Jo, who was perhaps 50, and had the hands of someone who'd spent years doing physical work and the eyes of someone who'd spent years thinking about things she couldn't say out loud. And a younger woman named Cass, who never talked about where she was from and was so relentlessly cheerful about everything that it was clearly armor, but good armor, well made and honestly worn. She learned that the 12 children were a varied group. Some had parents among the adult residents, some did not. Some were old enough to work and did. Some were young enough to mostly run around the yard getting underfoot, and occasionally being useful by accident. Joseph, the boy who'd taken Whitmore's horse, had an unofficial authority among the older children that he carried with the seriousness of someone who'd had to be an adult too early and was only recently being allowed to be something in between. She learned that Caleb Whitmore ate breakfast at the main house at 5:30 in the morning, then was usually not seen again until supper at 6, because he spent the daylight hours working. Not supervising, working. She saw him once helping pull a stuck wagon wheel from a muddy patch near the barn, up to his elbows in it alongside 2 of the ranch hands, without any visible concern for the fact that it was filthy work and he was the man who owned the place. That told her something too. What she hadn't learned by the end of that first week was anything concrete about why the Circle W operated the way it did. The community feel of the place was real. She could see it in the way people moved through their shared spaces, in the particular ease of people who'd been around each other long enough to develop a genuine shorthand. But the story behind it remained opaque. People were friendly. People were not forthcoming. It was Grace who started peeling back the edges of it, because Grace's work in the accounting room gave her access to the ranch's history in a way that walking around the yard didn't. The ranch has been operating as a residence for non-employees for at least 4 years, she said one evening, keeping her voice low, though the other women in the bunkhouse were asleep. The records show it. There are entries for people who were housed and fed without any corresponding wage entries, not because they weren't working, but because the work was listed under a different accounting category. He calls it community labor contribution, tracks it separately from paid wages. That's unusual, Georgina said. It's meticulous, Grace said, with something close to admiration, which from Grace was high praise. He's been documenting everything. Every person who came here, every resource spent, every agreement made. She paused. Georgina, some of these people, the entries describe their situations when they arrived. Women leaving dangerous marriages, men who'd been cheated out of land, families who'd lost children to creditors. She paused again. Us. Georgina was quiet for a moment. He documented us? He documented the auction, the debt amounts, the parties involved. Grace's voice was careful. He writes everything down. Outside, the Texas night was doing its usual loud insistence. Insects in the grass, wind through the cedar. Somewhere across the yard, the barn cat made a brief complaint about something and went silent. Why? Georgina said. I don't know yet, Grace said. But I think I'm going to find out. She found out, or part of it, on a Thursday morning in her 3rd week at the Circle W, when she was in the accounting room going through a set of older ledgers she'd found in the bottom drawer of the desk, and Whitmore came in and stopped when he saw what she was reading. He didn't say anything at first. He came to the desk and looked at the ledger she had open, one from 3 years prior, dense with entries. And then he pulled the chair from the corner of the room and sat down in it and looked at his hands. I should have told you those were there, he said. Probably, Grace said. She didn't close the ledger. He was quiet. Then, what do you want to know? Grace had been thinking about this since the night she'd told Georgina about the records, running through the questions in order of importance, the way she did with everything. How did this start? She asked. The ranch as it is now. Not when you bought the land. How did this part of it start? He exhaled. The war, he said. Not elaborating, as if the word itself should be sufficient explanation, and maybe it was. I came back and the place I'd left wasn't... He stopped. Tried again. Some things happen to you that you can't fix in yourself, but you can sometimes fix the version of it that's happening to someone else. It was not a complete answer. It wasn't even half of one, probably. But Grace had spent enough time around people who'd learned not to say certain things aloud to recognize that this was what was available, and pressing for more would just close the door. There are names in this ledger, she said. People who stayed and left. Are they safe? He said. The ones I know about, most of them. Qualification cost him something. She could see it in the way his jaw moved before he continued. Not all. You can't save everyone who comes through a door. I learned that. Doesn't mean you stop opening it. Grace looked at the ledger, and then at the man across from her who was, she was gradually understanding, carrying several different kinds of weight, and had organized his entire adult life around the management of that weight, rather than the putting down of it. The accounting system you were using, she said, shifting deliberately because she'd gotten what she came for and because changing the subject was the kindest thing she could do. The integration between supply and wages. He blinked, following the shift. What about it? I can fix it. It'll take me about 2 weeks to reconcile the current books and set up a proper integrated ledger. After that, it should take about 4 hours a week to maintain. He looked at her for a moment. All right. I'll need access to the prior year's supply records. They're in the box under the window. She looked at the box. She looked back at him. You knew exactly where they were. I keep track of things, he said. So I've noticed. He stood up and moved the chair back to the corner of the room. The conversation concluded to whatever extent it was going to be. At the door he stopped, and she thought he was going to say something significant, something that would tie the prior conversation together into something more shapely. Instead, he said, Ruth wants to rearrange the supply deliveries to Thursdays. You'll need to account for that in the new system. Noted, Grace said. He left. She sat alone in the accounting room with the old ledger open in front of her for a long moment. Then she pulled a fresh sheet of paper and a pen and began drawing up the structure of a new integrated ledger, because that was what Grace did. She found what needed organizing and organized it, and tried not to think too hard about the fact that what she was really doing was building a record of a man's long attempt to repair something in himself by repairing things in other people, and that this was, in its own unglamorous and imperfect way, one of the more honest things she'd ever had the opportunity to keep track of. The thread arrived with the mail. It came on a Tuesday in the 4th week, tucked inside the regular delivery from the Holt County Post. A letter addressed to Whitmore in the formal language of official correspondence, sealed with the stamp of the U.S. Marshal's office for the district. Ruth brought it to Whitmore at the barn, and Georgina happened to be nearby, returning tools to the outbuilding, and she saw his face when he broke the seal and read it. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something left it, some quality of ordinary attention that was usually there, and what replaced it was a particular stillness that wasn't peace. He folded the letter and put it in his coat and went back to what he'd been doing, which was repairing a section of harness leather with a tool and steady pressure, the kind of work that keeps your hands occupied while your mind goes somewhere else entirely. Georgina told herself it wasn't her business. She went to the outbuilding and put the tools away and told herself that again, on the way back. But at supper, she watched him across the table, and the stillness was still there. Not the settled quiet of a man at rest, but the contained, inward-turned quality of a man running calculations he hadn't finished yet. She didn't ask. It wasn't her place to ask. But that night, lying awake in the bunkhouse while Vera and Joe and Cass breathed steadily around her, and Eliza made the small sound she always made when she was dreaming, Georgina stared at the ceiling and thought about the accounting room ledger with all those names in it, all those people Whitmore had documented, all those careful records of who had come and what they'd needed and what had been given. All those people who would be findable if someone with official authority wanted to find them. She didn't know yet what the letter said. She didn't know who Victor Hale was. She'd learned both of those things, but not tonight. Tonight she only knew that a man who'd ridden a day and a half to stop an auction because separating a family troubled him had read a piece of paper and gone somewhere inside himself that he clearly didn't want company in, and that the peaceful, orderly life of the Circle W, the 6 o'clock suppers, the children arguing about rope, the kitchen building's perpetual smoke, Grace's ledgers, Eliza teaching the younger children their letters in the yard every afternoon, which she'd started doing on her own initiative 3 days after they arrived, and which no one had asked her to stop. All of it felt, to Georgina, lying in the dark, slightly less permanent than it had seemed that morning. She didn't sleep well. And in the morning, Whitmore was at breakfast at 5:30 as usual, and he ate without speaking more than necessary. And after he left, Ruth sat down at the table with a cup of coffee and looked at the door he'd gone through with an expression that said she'd seen that particular version of him before, and that the last time she had, things had gotten complicated. "Ruth," Georgina said. Ruth looked at her. "Who's Marshal Victor Hale?" Ruth wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She looked at the window. Outside, Joseph was leading the gray horse to the water trough, talking to it again, and the horse was doing the ear flick thing again. "Someone who's been looking for a reason," Ruth said. "A reason for what?" Ruth was quiet long enough that Georgina thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "A reason to take all of this apart." She stood up and took her coffee with her, and went back to the work of the morning, and the kitchen building's fire was stoked back up, and the children came out of the bunkhouses into the early light, and Grace went to the accounting room with her pen and her fresh ledger sheets, and Eliza set up her makeshift schoolroom in the shade of the east bunkhouse wall, and the Circle W went on being itself in all its imperfect, purposeful, carefully maintained ordinariness. But Georgina stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time, looking at nothing, turning Ruth's words over. A reason to take all of this apart. She thought about the contract in Grace's coat pocket. She thought about the names in the old ledger. She thought about Joseph and the horse, and Vera's jaw that had healed wrong, and Cass's relentless cheerfulness that was armor, and the soft towels on the first day, and a man who kept records of everything because records were the only proof that something had happened, that someone had been here, that it had mattered. She thought, not if I can help it. She didn't know yet what she could do. She didn't know yet what was coming. But she had been raised by a man who talked too much and planned too little, and she had learned from that. And she had stood on an auction block in the full sun and not cried. And she had walked out of Sweetwater Creek with nothing but her sisters and a contract and the specific hard-won knowledge that the world would not arrange itself kindly on her behalf, and she would have to be the one to do the arranging. Whatever Marshal Victor Hale was looking for, whatever reason he needed, she was going to make it very hard for him to find it. She went to help with the garden. The second letter came 10 days after the first. Whitmore read it at the breakfast table, which was unusual. He normally dealt with correspondence alone in the accounting room or out by the barn where no one was watching. And the fact that he read it in front of Ruth and Georgina and two of the ranch hands meant either that he'd stopped caring who saw his reaction or that he wanted witnesses to the fact that he had one. His face did the same thing it had done with the first letter, that departure of ordinary expression, that replacement stillness. He set it down on the table and finished his coffee and said to Ruth, without preamble, "He's coming, end of the month." Ruth put down her spoon. "How many men?" "Doesn't say. Official inspection is what he's calling it." The word inspection came out of his mouth with a flatness that said he understood exactly what that word was being used to cover. "Right to examine all residents, all records, all property on the grounds." Georgina was at the far end of the table pretending to be occupied with her breakfast. She was not pretending particularly well, but Whitmore looked at her directly and didn't seem to mind that she was listening. "You should know what this is about," he said. She set her fork down. "All right." He was quiet for a moment, organizing something. Not stalling, actually putting things in order, the way he did everything. "Victor Hale has been marshal of this district for 6 years. Before that he was in the army, same as me, different outfit. We crossed paths twice during the war and neither time was—" He paused. "He's not a stupid man. He's not even an entirely dishonest one in the ordinary sense. But he has a theory about what the law is for, and his theory is that it's for protecting arrangements that already exist. Property arrangements, social arrangements." He looked at the letter on the table. "The Circle W is an arrangement he didn't authorize and doesn't understand, and that bothers him in a way that I think has become personal." "The people here," Georgina said, "he'd consider them what? Fugitives?" "Some of them, technically, yes. Under laws I consider unjust and he considers settled." He picked up the letter and folded it. "Vera's husband filed a desertion claim through the county court in Brazos County 2 years ago. That gives him legal standing to compel her return under current statute. There are 3 other women here in similar situations, and the children without documentation—" He stopped. "Hale could argue that housing undocumented children without county authorization constitutes unlawful custody." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the morning was doing its ordinary things. Birds, the distant sound of someone splitting wood, indifferent to the conversation inside. "What did you do with the first letter?" Georgina asked. "Wrote to my lawyer in Austin," he said, waiting on a response. "And if the response isn't enough?" He didn't answer that, which was, she was learning, Caleb Whitmore's version of "I don't know yet," delivered without the words. Ruth stood and began clearing the table with the focused efficiency of a woman who processed bad news by doing the next necessary thing and the one after that. Georgina sat with her hands in her lap and thought about Vera, who was at this moment working in the laundry yard, who'd arrived at the Circle W in January with 2 children and a jaw healed wrong, and who had, in the past 3 weeks, laughed at something Cass said 3 times, genuinely laughed, the kind that catches you off guard. Which was the sort of small, specific evidence of a person slowly becoming themselves again that you noticed when you shared a room with someone. She thought about what compel her return meant in practice. She went to find Grace. Grace was in the accounting room, which she had by now reorganized so thoroughly that it looked like a different room, ledgers properly shelved and labeled, the supply records integrated into the main system, a new filing structure for correspondence that made the prior chaos look almost willfully obscure. She was cross-referencing the quarterly livestock figures against the feed purchase records, which was not something she'd been asked to do. It was something she'd decided needed doing, and so she was doing it. Georgina closed the door behind her and told her about both letters and everything Whitmore had said at breakfast. Grace listened without interrupting. When Georgina finished, Grace was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The documentation." "What?" "He documents everything. You told me that weeks ago." She turned in her chair to face the shelves. "Every person who came here, every agreement, every resource. He's been building a record." She stood up and went to the shelf with the oldest ledgers, the ones from the bottom drawer that she'd found in her 3rd week, and ran her finger along the spines. If Hale comes with legal authority to examine the records, those records either protect the people here or they expose them. It depends entirely on what's in them and how they're organized. "Whitmore knows that," Georgina said. "Does he know it well enough to have it ready?" She pulled one of the ledgers and opened it to a middle section. "Look at this. The entries for Vera. He's recorded her arrival date, the condition she was in, the nature of the situation she'd left. He's recorded it factually. Not sympathetically, factually." She turned a page. "That's useful. That's the kind of thing a lawyer could use to challenge a desertion claim, because it establishes a record of harm that predates any legal claim her husband filed." She closed the ledger. "But it's buried in here with 40 other entries and cross-referenced by date, not by name. If Hale arrives and demands to examine the records, it would take him 20 minutes to find exactly what he needs to hurt people with." Georgina understood immediately. "And about the same time to find what could protect them. So it depends on who gets to the records first and how they're organized before he arrives." They looked at each other. "How long do we have?" Grace asked. "He said end of the month. That's 17 days. Grace looked at the shelves. She looked at her new integrated ledger system, which she'd spent 2 weeks building and which was, Georgina could see her understanding in real time, going to need to be completely rebuilt with a different purpose in mind. "I need to talk to Whitmore," she said. "He's at the barn." She was already moving. Georgina didn't go to the barn. She went instead to the laundry yard, where Vera was wringing out a bedsheet with the focused physical commitment of someone who has learned that hard physical work is one of the more reliable ways to keep your mind from eating itself. She helped with the sheet without announcing her presence as anything more than an extra pair of hands. They worked the laundry line in companionable silence for a while, and then Georgina said, without looking at her, "Do you know about the marshal?" Vera's hand stilled on the sheet. "Ruth told me. Last week." She resumed working. "After the first letter. Whitmore's lawyer is working on it." "I know." Her voice was even. The evenness cost something. Georgina could hear the cost of it. "I've been through a legal process before, with my husband's family. I know how it goes when the people on the other side have money and you don't." "Whitmore has money." "Whitmore has a ranch and 22 people depending on him, and a marshal with a district warrant." She lifted the sheet over the line and smoothed it flat. "I'm not saying I've given up. I'm saying I know what I'm dealing with." Georgina handed her the next piece from the basket. "Your children. are here, Vera said. The two words had the quality of a statement she made to herself regularly, deliberately, as a counter to something. They're here, and they're safe, and that's what today is. I'll deal with what tomorrow is when it gets here. It was the most practical kind of courage Georgina had ever heard expressed, and she recognized it because she'd been living a version of it herself since the auction. And she didn't say anything else about it because there wasn't anything to say that would improve on what Vera had already said. They finished the laundry. In the accounting room, Grace and Whitmore talked for 2 hours. Georgina knew this because she was gardening within sight of the window, and she could see the occasional movement of people inside the room and the fact that neither of them came out. 2 hours was, for Whitmore, an extraordinary amount of talking. When he finally emerged, he had the look of a man who had been argued with thoroughly and found it a more useful experience than he'd anticipated. He saw Georgina in the garden and stopped. "Your sister wants to reorganize the records," he said. "I know. She says it needs to happen before Hale arrives. New filing structure, protective documentation in front, harmful material. Her word, harmful. Either removed or contextualized in a way a court would understand." "She's right," Georgina said. "She's also going to need to know the full history of every person in those records to know which material is which." He looked at the accounting room window. "That's a lot of history." "She'll handle it with discretion," Georgina said. "She's been handling your books for a month. Has she given you any reason not to trust her?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, and then after another pause, "She wants your help." "She has it." He nodded and went back toward the barn, and Georgina pulled off her garden gloves and went inside. They worked on the records for 11 days. Grace led it with the precision she brought to everything. Systematic, methodical, nothing moved without understanding why it was being moved. Georgina sorted and cross-referenced. They talked to Ruth about the histories of people on the ranch, and Ruth talked to those people. And some of them came to the accounting room themselves and told Grace what they needed her to understand about their situations. And Grace listened and took notes and did not ask questions that weren't necessary and did not react in ways that would have been understandable but unhelpful. Eliza kept the children's schoolroom running through all of it. She'd expanded it from morning sessions to most of the day, partly because the children had more to learn than she'd initially realized, and partly because having 12 children occupied and purposeful meant 12 fewer anxious small people absorbing the tension that had begun spreading through the ranch like weather coming in. Joseph had stopped talking to the horses as much. Georgina noticed this. He spent more time near the main house, watching the road, which was the behavior of a child who'd learned early that threats arrived on roads, and that watching was the only warning system available to someone without power. She told Whitmore this one evening, and he looked at her for a moment and then went and found Joseph and had a conversation with him that Georgina wasn't close enough to hear, and afterward Joseph's posture changed. Not into ease, because he was 12 and had learned things that don't undo easily, but into something that was at least not quite so much alone. The response from the Austin lawyer arrived on a Wednesday, 6 days before the end of the month. Whitmore read it in the accounting room with Grace present because she was always there now, and she told Georgina about it that evening. "The lawyer says Hale's authority to examine residents is legally ambiguous," Grace said. "He can inspect property and business records under his district warrant, but compelling residents to testify or submit to identification without individual warrants for each person is on much weaker ground." She had her notes in front of her, written in the small, precise script she used for things she intended to remember accurately. "The lawyer is filing a preemptive challenge in the federal court in Austin. It won't stop Hale from coming. It's too late for that. But it creates an official record that we contested his authority before he arrived, which matters if this goes to court afterward." "What about Vera?" Georgina asked, "and the others with outstanding claims against them?" Grace's expression did something complicated. "The lawyer says those situations are the most difficult. The desertion statutes are real. He can argue mitigating circumstances, but it's not a fast process." She looked at her notes. He used the word complicated 4 times in one paragraph. Lawyers usually mean expensive and uncertain when they say complicated. What does Whitmore want to do? He wants to have a meeting. The whole ranch. Everyone who's old enough to understand. Grace looked up. "Tomorrow evening." The meeting happened in the open area between the bunkhouses because it was the only space large enough to hold everyone. Whitmore stood in front of them. All the adults, the older children, Ruth at his right side, Grace and her sisters in the middle of the gathered group. And he said what was happening with the directness of a man who decided that these people had a right to information about their own circumstances. He told them about Hale. He told them about the legal challenge. He told them what the lawyer had said. He told them, specifically, that the people with outstanding legal claims against them had options. They could stay and let the lawyer fight. They could leave before Hale arrived, or they could seek temporary placement with families in neighboring counties who'd agreed to take them. He'd already made those arrangements, had made them after the first letter, which meant he'd been thinking about this since the beginning. Nobody said anything for a moment when he finished. Then Vera said, from somewhere in the middle of the group, "I'm staying." One of the other women said, "So am I." And then a man named Dodd, who'd been at the ranch for a year and had a situation involving a land dispute in another county that Georgina didn't know the full details of, said, "I didn't run before and I'm not running now." That was the meeting. Afterward, Georgina found Whitmore at the edge of the yard, where the fence met the cedar scrub and you could see a long distance in the fading light. She stood beside him without having planned to. "They didn't have to stay," she said. "No," he said. "You gave them a real choice. You had somewhere for them to go." "Yes." She looked at the distance for a moment. "That cost you something, setting up those arrangements." He didn't confirm or deny it. What he said was, it would have cost more to offer them no choice at all. She turned to look at him then. He was looking at the horizon with the particular expression of a man thinking about something past the edge of what was visible, and she understood, standing there, that the cost he was talking about wasn't money. "Why do you keep the records?" she asked. Not meaning the accounting ledgers, meaning the other ones, the ones with the names and the dates and the careful factual notation of what people had been going through when they arrived. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because people disappear. Into arrangements they didn't choose, into situations that don't leave a trace." He paused. "If I write it down, it happened. It can't be made to have not happened." She thought about her father's debts, which had been real and documented, and her family's auction, which had also been real and documented, and the way certain kinds of documentation were used to erase people while other kinds could be used to prove they existed. "That's why Grace's reorganization matters," she said. "Yes," he said. Marshal Victor Hale arrived on the 28th of the month, which was 2 days earlier than the end of the month and clearly deliberate, the kind of small strategic discourtesy designed to catch people in a state of preparation rather than readiness. He came with 7 men. They rode in a loose formation that wasn't quite military and wasn't quite casual, landing somewhere in the territory of a group that knew how to look like authority without committing fully to its costs. Hale himself was a tall man, lean through the chest, with a face that had the weathered handsomeness of someone who'd spent decades outdoors and knew it was an asset and used it. He wore his badge with the ease of a man who'd never once had it questioned, and had consequently forgotten what it was like to have something questioned. He looked at the Circle W ranch as he rode in, the main house, the bunkhouses, the people pausing in their work to watch him, with the satisfied expression of a man seeing something he's been waiting to see confirmed. Whitmore was at the front gate. He'd been there for an hour, which meant either he'd anticipated the early arrival or he'd decided that the gate was the appropriate place to receive official visitors and had simply been there since morning. Either way, he was standing when Hale rode up, and the 2 men regarded each other across the fence with the specific quality of people who have a history and have each decided to behave as if they don't. "Whitmore," said Hale. "Marshal," said Whitmore. Hale had a document in his hand, the inspection order, presumably. He held it out. Whitmore took it and read it without any visible haste, which Georgina suspected was a deliberate counter to whatever rhythm Hale had planned for the morning. She was watching from near the kitchen building where she'd been stationed by an unspoken agreement with Grace and Ruth. Ruth was in the main house. Grace was in the accounting room. Eliza had the children in the east bunkhouse with strict instructions to do schoolwork and not come out until someone came and got them. Whitmore folded the inspection order and handed it back. "My lawyer in Austin has filed a preemptive challenge to the scope of this warrant," he said. "The documentation was sent to your district office 4 days ago. You should have received it." Hale's expression didn't change, which meant he had received it. "That challenge is under review," he said. "In the meantime, the warrant stands." "The warrant stands for property and business records," Whitmore said, "not for residents."
The warrant stands for what the warrant says, Hale said. I'll be the judge of what that includes. He swung down from his horse, and his 7 men did the same, and they came through the gate with the organized purpose of people who'd done this before and knew how it went when the other party had no legal recourse. Whitmore stepped back. He was not going to fight 7 armed men in his front yard, and Hale knew this, and Hale's mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. Georgina watched Hale's men spread through the property, 2 toward the bunkhouses, 2 toward the barn, 1 to the outbuildings, 2 staying with Hale himself as he walked toward the main house with Whitmore beside him. She watched, and she thought about the records, which Grace had spent 11 days reorganizing, which were now arranged so that what Hale found first, if he looked, was documentation of the ranch's legal operations, the wages, the supply accounts, the livestock inventory, everything in proper order. And what he found second was the resident records, which were now organized in a way that Grace had described, with characteristic precision, as telling the right story in the right order. She had no idea if it would be enough. She crossed the yard and went through the side door of the main house and found Ruth in the kitchen, standing very still with her hands flat on the work table. He has 2 men going to the bunkhouses, Georgina said. Ruth said, Vera knows. I told her this morning. She knows not to run and not to give her name first. She looked at the ceiling briefly. She knows. In the accounting room, which Georgina could get to through the back hallway without crossing the main room where Hale and Whitmore had gone, she found Grace at the desk with the ledgers in front of her, open to the current business accounts. Her posture was the posture of someone who had been sitting exactly like this for some time and intended to continue sitting exactly like this. Hale appeared in the doorway 12 minutes later. He looked at the room, the organized shelves, the labeled files, the woman sitting at the desk with a ledger open in front of her, and something registered in his expression that wasn't what he'd been expecting. He'd been expecting, Georgina thought, disorder, the kind of record-keeping you found in operations that had something to hide. What Grace had built instead was something that looked, at first and second glance, like the work of someone with absolutely nothing to hide. These are the ranch's business records? Hale said. Grace looked up from the ledger as if she'd only just noticed him. Yes, sir. I'm the ranch's accountant. Can I help you find something specific? Hale came into the room. His eyes moved along the shelves. All records pertaining to residents and persons housed on this property, Grace said, without hesitation. Those are filed under property residents, bottom shelf, right side. They're organized by arrival date and cross-referenced by labor classification. She paused. Should I pull the relevant years, or would you prefer to start with current? Hale looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not suspicion exactly, but reassessment. He'd come in expecting to find something that would take him 30 seconds to locate and would be immediately damning. What he was looking at instead was a filing system so organized and so apparently above board that finding what he wanted inside it would require time and cross-referencing that his inspection warrant did not give him unlimited space for. Current, he said. Grace stood and went to the bottom shelf and pulled the current resident file with the ease of someone who knew exactly where everything was because she had put it there herself. She set it on the desk and returned to her chair and went back to her ledger. Hale opened the file. He read. His face gave nothing away. He was practiced at that, Georgina could see, but the pace of his reading was telling. He went through the first 3 entries quickly, looking for something obvious. He slowed at the 4th. He went back to the 3rd. He turned 2 pages and stopped. Georgina was standing in the doorway, which was not subtle, but Hale didn't tell her to leave, and she didn't offer to. Vera Hutchins, Hale said, currently residing here. Yes, Grace said without looking up. There's an outstanding legal claim. Brazos County, filed February 1871, Grace said. Cross-reference to supporting documentation is on the tab marked with the blue paper. She turned a page in her own ledger. The supporting documentation includes the attending physician's report from the county hospital in October 1870, which predates the desertion claim by 4 months. Hale found the blue-tabbed page. He read it. His jaw moved slightly. The physician's report was real. Grace had found it in the bottom of the old ledger, misfiled under a supply account from the same period, and had spent most of one evening recopying it clearly and placing it in exactly the position where it would be found at exactly the right moment. This doesn't invalidate the claim, Hale said. No, Grace said, but it complicates it substantially.
Our attorney in Austin can provide more information if the marshal's office is interested in pursuing the matter through proper channels. She looked up then, for the first time since he'd entered the room. Is the marshal's office interested in pursuing it through proper channels? The question was asked in the tone of someone asking about the weather. It was one of the most perfectly calibrated things Georgina had ever heard another human being say. Hale looked at her. Grace looked back. The silence between them had a very specific quality. It was the silence of two people who understood each other precisely and were each deciding what to do with that understanding. Outside, there was a sound. Voices, raised. Georgina turned and went quickly through the back hallway to the side door and out into the yard. One of Hale's men had Dodd by the arm near the barn.
Not roughly, not yet, but with the proprietary certainty of a man who expected no resistance. Dodd was not resisting, but his face had the set expression of a man very carefully not doing the thing he most wanted to do. Two of the ranch hands were standing nearby with the stillness of people deciding. Whitmore was across the yard. He'd seen it. He crossed the distance with the unhurried walk of a man who is working very hard at appearing unhurried, and walked directly to Hale's deputy and said, "What's your individual warrant for this man?" The deputy looked at him. "I don't need—" "You need an individual warrant to detain a specific person. The inspection order covers property. You're holding a person." Whitmore's voice was very even. "Do you have a warrant?" "My authority comes from the marshal." "Then go get the marshal and ask him to show me the paperwork." Whitmore looked at the hand on Dodd's arm. "In the meantime, you're going to want to let go." The deputy was younger than Whitmore. He was also, Georgina could see, doing a calculation. The calculation of what his authority actually covered and what it didn't, and how much of this was going to matter to him personally afterward. He released Dodd's arm. Dodd stepped away. He didn't look at Whitmore because he knew, probably, that Whitmore didn't want to be looked at gratefully in front of a marshal's deputy, because gratitude was not the appropriate register for this moment. Hale appeared from the main house. He'd heard the exchange. His expression was the expression of a man who has spent 6 years making people understand that his authority was not to be questioned, encountering someone who questioned it on procedural grounds rather than defiant ones, which was a different and more difficult problem. "Whitmore," he said. "Marshal," Whitmore said. The yard was very quiet. The ranch hands had stopped. Ruth had appeared at the kitchen building door. Georgina was at the side of the main house. And Vera was standing at the door of the east bunkhouse with her arms folded across her chest and her chin level, watching. "Your lawyer's filing is a delaying tactic," Hale said. "My lawyer's filing is a legal challenge," Whitmore said. "Those sometimes look similar from the outside." Hale's eyes moved around the yard, taking in the people, the property, the organized resistance of a place that had clearly been prepared for this visit. "You're hiding people here." "I'm employing people," Whitmore said, "and housing them under terms documented in the business records your deputy has been examining." He paused. "If the marshal has specific legal grounds against specific individuals, his office is welcome to pursue those grounds through the appropriate courts. We won't obstruct that." He paused again. "We will document everything that happens here today." Hale looked at him for a long moment. The moment stretched. Then he said, to no one in particular, "Finish the property inspection," and walked back toward the main house. It was not a retreat, but it was not what he'd come for either. He'd come to walk through this place and collect what he needed to dismantle it. What he'd found instead was an operation so organized, so documented, so procedurally prepared for his arrival that dismantling it was going to require more than a district inspection order and 7 men on a Tuesday in late July. Georgina let out a breath she'd been holding for most of the morning. She looked at Whitmore. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching Hale's men continue their inspection with the focused attention of a man keeping account. But his shoulders had changed, not relaxed. He was too experienced to relax before this was over. But the extreme stillness of the past week had shifted into something slightly less like a man bracing for an impact he couldn't stop. The inspection took 3 more hours. Hale's men went through the bunkhouses, the barn, the outbuildings, the kitchen. They asked questions. Ruth answered them with the brisk accuracy of a woman who had decided that maximum cooperation on the surface was the most effective form of resistance available to her. Vera answered questions about her employment with the same tone and with references to the documentation in the accounting room that clearly irritated the deputy asking them. At 4 in the afternoon, Hale came out of the main house with his file of notes and stood in the yard and looked at the circle W one more time, the way a man looks at something he intends to come back to. He looked at Whitmore. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Whitmore agreed. "I didn't think it was." Hale mounted his horse, his men mounted their horses. They rode out through the gate in the same loose formation they had arrived in, and the dust from their passage settled slowly, and the Circle W stood in the late afternoon light looking exactly as it had looked that morning, imperfect and purposeful and still there. Joseph appeared at the barn door and watched the riders until they were gone from sight. Then he went back inside, and a moment later Georgina heard him talking to the gray horse again, the low murmur of someone reporting in to the only listener they fully trusted, and the horse's ear flicking in its patient acknowledgement. Vera sat down on the step of the east bunkhouse and pressed her hands to her knees and stayed like that for a moment with her eyes closed. Then she opened them and looked at Georgina across the yard and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. But her expression was the expression of someone who has been through the worst of a thing and has come out the other side of it still in possession of themselves. Grace came out of the accounting room with the resident file under her arm and found Whitmore near the fence. "He'll come back with more paperwork," she said. "Yes," he said. "We need more than documentation. We need someone at the federal level to look at Hale's conduct." She paused. "Not just his authority, his conduct, the way he uses the law." Whitmore looked at her. "That's a harder thing to prove." "I know," she said, "but I've been in your records for 6 weeks. I know what's in them." She met his eyes. "If you'll let me put together a proper account, not a legal filing, not yet, but a documented narrative of the pattern, we could take it to someone above Hale's pay grade." He was quiet. "You've been keeping records because it makes things real," she said. "I'm telling you we can use them to make him real, what he actually does, not just what his warrant says." The sun was going down behind the cedar scrub. The ranch was beginning its evening routines. The kitchen building filling with sound, children coming in from the yard, the ranch hands washing up at the pump, the ordinary necessary rhythms of a place that had just been threatened and had not broken. Whitmore looked at the gate where Hale had ridden out, and then back at Grace. "Do it," he said. Showmore 1716 Claude responded. Grace worked on the narrative document for 9 days straight. Grace worked on the narrative document for 9 days straight. She worked in the accounting room from before first light until after supper, with breaks only when Ruth physically appeared in the doorway and told her to eat something, which Grace would do standing at the work table before going back to her desk. Georgina brought her coffee in the mornings and found her sometimes still in the same position she'd left her in the night before, which meant she'd slept at the desk, which meant the document was becoming something Grace considered more urgent than her own rest, which told Georgina everything she needed to know about how serious the situation remained despite Hale's departure. The document was not a legal filing. Grace had been clear about that from the beginning. She wasn't a lawyer, and a document that pretended to be legal argument written by a non-lawyer would be worse than no document at all. What she was building instead was a chronological account. Every instance in the ranch records where Marshall Hale's office had made contact with the Circle W or with individuals connected to it, cross-referenced against the statutory authority those contacts had been conducted under, with notations wherever the conduct had exceeded or misrepresented that authority. She pulled from Whitmore's correspondence files, from the old ledgers, from the notes he'd kept in the margins of inspection orders she found in a box she hadn't opened before. He had been documenting Hale, too. Not aggressively, not in a way that looked like preparation for a fight, more in the way of a man who wrote things down because things that were written down were harder to unhappen. But the record was there, going back 3 years, and what it showed, assembled into a continuous account by Grace's careful hand, was a pattern. Hale had visited the Circle W 4 times before this most recent inspection. 3 of those visits had been nominally justified by routine district oversight. The 4th, 2 years prior, had resulted in the departure of 2 residents, a man named Calvert and his sister, who had left the ranch within a week of Hale's visit, and whose subsequent whereabouts were unrecorded. There was a note in Whitmore's margin, written in his spare handwriting, "Calvert gone. Could not reach. E also gone. Don't know if voluntary." Georgina read that note over Grace's shoulder one evening and didn't say anything for a long time. He didn't know if they left on their own, she said finally. No, Grace said, and he still kept the gate open after that. Grace set her pen down and looked at the note. Yes. Georgina straightened up. She thought about that for the rest of the evening, the particular kind of stubborn, grief-adjacent courage it took to keep doing something when you knew it might end that way again. She'd thought of Whitmore, until now, as a man with a system, a man who organized his compassion so that it could be sustained. What the margin note showed her was that the system had already failed him, and he'd rebuilt it and kept going anyway, not because he'd solved the problem of loss, but because he'd decided the alternative was worse. She told him what she'd seen. The next morning at the fence line where he was checking the post holes one of the ranch hands had dug the day before. He didn't answer for a moment. Then he said, Calvert was from a county where the land records had been falsified during the war. He had a legitimate claim, but proving it would have taken years and money he didn't have. He pushed one of the posts to check its stability. Hale's visit wasn't a coincidence. He'd come 3 weeks before that and asked questions I should have understood better. By the time I did understand them, it was too late. You blame yourself, Georgina said. It was my failure to read the situation correctly, he said, which was not the same as yes and not the same as no, and was, she was understanding, how Whitmore talked about things that had cost him, not with self-pity, with the flat accounting of a man who kept honest books about everything, including himself. Grace's document is nearly finished, she said. I know, she told me last night. He moved to the next post. She wants to send it to a federal judge in Austin, a man named Calder. He's reviewed 3 cases of martial misconduct in the past 5 years. Is he trustworthy? More than most. Less than I'd like. He looked down the fence line. It's the best available option, which isn't the same as a good one. She watched him work for a moment. You're not going to tell me it'll be fine. No, he said. Good, she said. I've had enough of people telling me things will be fine. He glanced at her then, briefly, the kind of look that acknowledged something without making a speech about it. Then he went back to checking the fence posts, and she went back to the garden, and the morning continued in its ordinary way around both of them. The document left for Austin on a Thursday, carried by one of the ranch hands named Aldrich, who was reliable, and who knew without being told explicitly that the contents of the packet he was carrying were not to be discussed at any stop along the way. Whitmore sent a separate letter to the Austin lawyer explaining what was being sent and why, and a third letter to a man in the district court whose name Georgina didn't recognize, but whom Whitmore referred to briefly as someone who owed him a conversation. Then they waited. Waiting at the Circle W in the weeks after Hale's departure had a particular quality. The ranch continued its work, the rhythms didn't change, but everything had the slightly too careful quality of people going about their ordinary lives while listening for something beyond the ordinary. The kitchen still produced supper at 6. Eliza still taught the children in the east bunkhouse yard. Joseph still talked to the horses. Vera's children still ran through the yard in the afternoons with the absolute physical commitment of children who have discovered, against prior experience, that running is safe. But Dodd had started sleeping lightly. Cass's cheerfulness had an effortful quality it hadn't had before. Ruth moved through her days with the compressed efficiency of someone who was making sure everything was in order against the possibility that it might need to be handed off at short notice. And Whitmore, who had always been self-contained, became more so. Not cold, not distant, but internally occupied in a way that Georgina could feel in the space around him when she was near him, like standing near a machine that's running at full capacity with none of the motion visible on the outside. Grace noticed too, though she expressed it differently. He's carrying too much of this alone, she told Georgina one night. He's been doing that for years, Georgina said. I know, that doesn't make it less stupid. She turned over on her bunk. He should have people helping him make decisions, not just implementing them. He's not used to that. No, Grace said. He's used to being the one who holds things together, which works until it doesn't. She was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about what happens after this. Whatever after looks like. What do you mean? The ranch needs a proper structure, not just Whitmore's judgment and Ruth's management and whoever happens to be capable showing up and being put to use. It needs... She stopped, chose her words. It needs to be the kind of thing that can exist without any one person being the reason it exists. Otherwise, it's always one man on a horse away from falling apart.
Georgina lay in the dark thinking about that, about the auction in Sweetwater Creek, which had been possible because their father's debts were held by individuals rather than institutions, which meant when those individuals decided to collect, there was nothing between the Fraser sisters and the auction block except the kindness of strangers, and strangers had not been particularly kind. About how the Circle W was, in its current form, essentially the same structure, held together by one man's money and judgment and by the human relationships he'd built, which were real and were enough, until they weren't. Grace wasn't wrong, but Grace was also, Georgina thought, already 3 steps ahead of the present emergency, which was both her greatest strength and the thing that occasionally made her exhausting to live with. Cheeked. The response from Austin came 2 weeks after the document was sent. Not from Judge Calder, not yet. From the lawyer, whose letter was 3 pages long and began with the sentence, "The material you have provided is among the most systematically documented accounts of martial misconduct I have encountered in 14 years of federal practice." He used the word remarkable once, which Georgina suspected was not a word he deployed often, given that the rest of the letter was written in the tone of a man who'd trained himself to be precise rather than expressive. He outlined a course of action. He named specific statutes. He said he had made contact with Judge Calder's clerk, and that Calder had agreed to review the documentation personally. He also said, "I must be honest with you about the timeline. This is not a fast process. Marshal Hale will almost certainly make another attempt before any formal ruling can be issued. I would strongly advise being prepared for that." Whitmore read this letter at the breakfast table. He read it through twice, set it down, and said to Grace, who was sitting across from him, "He says Calder will look at it." "I read the same letter," Grace said. She had her own copy because Whitmore had handed it to her before he'd finished it himself, which was a small gesture that Georgina noted and that Grace accepted without comment, which was its own kind of conversation. "He says Hale will come back before the ruling." "Also in the letter," Grace said. "What do you want to do about it?" Whitmore looked at his coffee. "I've been thinking about what you said, about structure." Grace looked up from the letter. This was not what she'd expected him to say. "If the ranch is going to survive this, survive past this, it can't be the way it's been," he said. "One man's decision, one man's money, one man's name on everything." He looked at the accounting room door across the hall, though the books were not visible from where they were sitting. "I want to formalize it. Register the community operation as a separate legal entity. Board of managers. Documented charter. The kind of thing that doesn't disappear because one person disappears." Grace set the letter down carefully. "That would also make it much harder for Hale to claim you're running an unauthorized operation. A registered entity has rights a private household doesn't." "That's part of it," he said. "How long would it take to set up?" "The lawyer can file the charter. 3 to 4 weeks if we move fast." He looked at her. "I'd want you involved in drafting the governance structure." Grace said, "I'll need to understand the financial parameters. What assets you're prepared to commit to the entity versus what remains personal property." "I'll get you the figures." They talked for another 40 minutes. Georgina sat at the far end of the table and did not interrupt, because this was the conversation that needed to happen and she was not the one who needed to have it. What she watched instead was the quality of the exchange, the way Grace pushed back on 2 of Whitmore's proposed governance structures with specific objections that he listened to without defensiveness, the way he provided information she asked for directly and without hedging, the way the whole conversation had the character of 2 people who'd moved, without ceremony, into a working partnership that was more honest than many she'd observed between people who'd known each other for years. At the end of it, Whitmore stood and said, "I'll write to the lawyer today." Grace said, "I'll start on the charter draft." He nodded. He went outside. Grace sat at the breakfast table for another moment with a look on her face that Georgina had seen maybe 3 times in her life. The look Grace got when something had gone unexpectedly, precisely right. And then she took her letter and went to the accounting room. The second inspection came 3 weeks later, not from Hale directly, but from 2 deputies he sent ahead, ostensibly to serve notice of an upcoming formal hearing in the district court, a hearing at which Whitmore was being called to account for, as the notice put it, operating an unauthorized residential facility in violation of county ordinance and district statute. The notice was real. The lawyer confirmed it by telegram the next day. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out,
which gave them time to prepare a response. And the lawyer was already preparing it. But the notice itself was a different kind of problem than a letter or even an inspection. It was public record, which meant it could circulate, which meant that people in neighboring counties who might otherwise have remained uninvolved would know about the Circle W and what Hale was claiming it was. Whitmore told the ranch at supper. He told them about the hearing, about the lawyer's response, about the charter filing, which was now in process with the Austin court, and which would, if approved in time, substantially change the legal character of what Hale was challenging. He told them honestly that the hearing was a risk, and that anyone who wanted to leave before it became public attention had his full support and the travel arrangements he'd already made once before. No one left. This time, Dodd said it first. "I'm not going." And then most of the other adults said some version of the same thing, and the ones who didn't say anything sat with their jaws set in the particular expression of people who had already made their decision and didn't feel the need to announce it. Vera, who was at the end of the table near Georgina, said quietly, "He keeps giving us a way out." "Yes," Georgina said, "and we keep not taking it." "Yes, that's probably a problem for him." Georgina looked at her. "What do you mean?" "He keeps trying to make sure this is our choice," Vera said, "because he doesn't want us here out of, I don't know, desperation, obligation, no other option." She picked up her fork. "But the thing is, when people keep choosing to stay, that means they're choosing him, and he doesn't quite know what to do with that." Georgina looked at Whitmore across the table. He was listening to something Dodd was saying with the focused attention he gave everything, but there was something in his posture, a slight, specific rigidity, that she recognized now as the posture of a man who was not comfortable being the object of other people's loyalty. He was comfortable being responsible for people. That was different. She thought about what Vera had said for several days afterward. The break came from a direction none of them had anticipated. It was Ruth who found it, which made sense in retrospect. Ruth, who'd been at the Circle W longer than anyone except Whitmore himself, and who had a network of correspondence across the district that she'd built quietly over years and never discussed in any particular detail. She received a letter on a Monday morning and read it at the kitchen table with the coffee going cold beside her, and then she went directly to Whitmore's office in the main house, which she only did when something couldn't wait. Georgina found out an hour later from the expression on Whitmore's face when he came out of the office and the way he said, simply, "Get Grace." The letter Ruth had received was from a woman named Margaret Alt, who lived in Caldwell County and who had been corresponding with Ruth for 2 years about various matters that Ruth had kept private. Margaret Alt's husband was a county clerk, and Margaret Alt had, over the course of the past 18 months, kept her own quiet record of certain things her husband had mentioned at home, conversations he'd had, documents that had passed through his office, requests that had come down from the marshal's district office about specific individuals, requests that had no apparent statutory basis, but which her husband had been told to process and not to question. Her letter to Ruth contained a summary of those records. And what they showed was that in at least 6 instances, Victor Hale had used his position as district marshal to direct county clerks to file or suppress documents, land records, desertion claims, property transfers, in ways that served the interests of specific parties who were not the county and were not the law. One of those parties was Harold Beaumont, Sweetwater Creek, the man who'd bid $32 for Georgina at the auction, the man whose toothpick had snapped when Whitmore outbid him, the man whose back, retreating across the dirt street, had carried the specific rigidity of a postponement rather than a concession. Grace read Margaret Alt's letter twice. She set it down. She looked at Whitmore. "Hale and Beaumont," she said. "The land parcel north of Sweetwater Creek," Whitmore said. "Beaumont's been acquiring it piece by piece for 3 years. 2 of the parcels involved families who left under unclear circumstances, and Hale's office processed the title transfers." "You knew about this?" "I knew about Beaumont. I knew the circumstances of those families. I didn't have documentation connecting them to Hale until now." He looked at the letter. "Margaret Alt has been building this for 18 months. "We need her records," Grace said immediately. "The originals or certified copies. A letter isn't enough. It's hearsay until we have the underlying documents." "Ruth is already writing back." "The lawyer needs to know today." "I'm writing to him this afternoon." Grace stood up and went to the window. Outside, Eliza was in the schoolyard with 8 children who were involved in what appeared to be a debate about arithmetic that had become personal. One of the smaller children was sitting apart from the group looking at a beetle on the ground with the serene detachment of someone who'd decided the arithmetic debate was not their problem. "This changes the filing," Grace said. "Yes," Whitmore said. "It's not just Hale exceeding his authority anymore. It's Hale using his authority as an instrument of private financial interest. That's a different legal category. That's why I need you to help me draft the supplemental documentation." She turned from the window. "When?" "Now," he said. "If that works." It worked. They spent 3 days on the supplemental document, Grace, Whitmore, and the Austin lawyer communicating by telegram and letter, in what became a compressed, efficient exchange that Georgina observed with the specific admiration she reserved for watching people who were very good at things do those things under pressure. The lawyer was cautious about Margaret Olt's records until the originals arrived by secure courier 10 days later, at which point he sent a telegram that said only, "This is sufficient. Filing with Calder's office tomorrow." The charter for the formal community entity came back approved from the Austin court the same week. Whitmore read the approval and handed it to Grace without comment, and Grace set it in the new file she'd created for it and labeled the tab in her small, precise script. And neither of them made a speech about it, because that was not how either of them operated. But that evening at supper, Ruth put 2 bottles of something on the table that she'd apparently been saving for an occasion she hadn't specified in advance, and the meal was louder than usual, and Dodd told a story about something that had happened to him before he came to the Circle W that was the first time Georgina had heard him volunteer personal history. And several of the children stayed at the table past their usual time because the adults were being interesting. And Eliza laughed at something Joseph said, and Joseph looked surprised and then pleased in the way of a 12-year-old who hadn't expected to be funny. Whitmore sat at the head of the table and ate his supper and did not say much, which was usual, but the quality of his quiet was different. Not the inward occupied quality of recent weeks, but something closer to a man who was simply present in the room he was in, which for him was not a small thing. Georgina, sitting across from him with the noise of the table around her, noticed the difference. She didn't say anything about it. Judge Calder's ruling on the preemptive challenge came 5 days before the scheduled district court hearing. It was not a complete victory, because complete victories in legal matters were, as the lawyer had been careful to explain, mostly a thing people expected from novels rather than courts. What it was, a formal finding that Hale's use of his inspection authority in the August visit had exceeded statutory limits in 2 specific respects, and a directive that the scheduled district court hearing be stayed pending a federal review of the underlying authority questions, which meant the hearing was stopped, not permanently, not necessarily, but stopped. The lawyer's accompanying letter said, "Judge Calder's finding does not resolve the substantive questions, but it creates a federal record that will substantially constrain Hale's options going forward. The supplemental documentation regarding the Beaumont connection has been forwarded to the Federal Marshal's Oversight Office. That process moves slowly, but it moves." Whitmore read this at the breakfast table, as he'd read all the significant letters, and said to Grace, "He says it moves slowly." "It does," Grace said. "But it moves." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Hale's not going to accept this quietly." "No," Grace said. "He's going to be angrier, and he's going to look for another approach. But he's also going to be operating under a federal court's eye, which changes what's available to him." She picked up her coffee. "He can still hurt people. He just has to be more careful about how he does it." "That's not entirely reassuring." "No," she said. "It's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be accurate." He looked at her with the expression she was starting to be able to read, the one where he was reassessing something and doing it quickly, and was slightly disconcerted by the results. Then he said, "You understand this situation better than I do." "Not the ranch," she said. "I understand the legal and financial architecture better. You understand the people." She set her cup down. "That's why the charter structure we drafted gives operational decisions to the board, but resource decisions to you, because those aren't the same kind of judgment." He accepted this without debate, which was one of his more useful qualities. Outside, the morning was doing what Texas mornings did in late summer, the light coming in at an angle that made everything look briefly like it had been deliberated over, and then the heat arriving and making it all practical again. Joseph went past the window with a bucket, talking to someone Georgina couldn't see from where she sat, and the rhythm of his words carried the ease of someone who'd started to believe, in the provisional way of children who've been hurt, that today was probably safe. Georgina put her cup down and said, to no one in particular, "What happens now?" Ruth, who'd come in from the kitchen building during the conversation and was standing at the end of the table with her apron still on, said, "Same as always. There's laundry," which was not a complete answer and was exactly right anyway, and the table cleared in the particular efficient way of people with actual work waiting for them, and the Circle W moved into its day. Sad. 3 weeks after the ruling, on a dry Thursday afternoon, 2 men arrived at the Circle W who were not from Hale's office. They were from the Federal Marshal's Oversight Office in San Antonio. They had credentials that Whitmore checked against the directory his lawyer had sent him, and they were legitimate, and they were not friendly in the way of men doing you a favor, but professional in the way of men doing a job they took seriously, which was better. They spent 2 days at the ranch. They interviewed Whitmore, Ruth, and Grace. They reviewed the documentation, the original records, Grace's narrative account, the supplemental Beaumont material, the charter, all of it. They asked questions that were specific and well-informed, which meant someone at the oversight office had read the filings carefully before sending them. They did not interview the general residents. They did not ask for names or statuses. Georgina wasn't sure if that was because the oversight process had a defined scope that didn't include residents, or because someone up the chain had decided that compiling a list of names would create exactly the kind of record that had caused the problem in the first place. Either way, she was grateful. On the second evening, the senior of the 2 men, a heavy-set fellow named Briggs, who had the manner of someone who'd been doing this work for long enough to have seen most of what there was to see and had developed a careful neutrality about almost all of it, sat with Whitmore in the main house's front room and said, "Your documentation is thorough." "My accountant put it together," Whitmore said. Briggs looked toward the accounting room, though the door was closed. "She does good work." "Yes," Whitmore said. "She does. Marshal Hale is going to be under formal review as of next week. I can't tell you what the outcome of that will be. These things take time and the results aren't guaranteed." He looked at his hands. "But I can tell you that what you've sent to Calder's office is the kind of material that tends to have consequences." Whitmore said, "How long does this tend to take?" 6 months? Maybe a year." He looked up. "I know that's not the answer you want." "No," Whitmore said, "but it's the one I expected." Briggs and his colleague left the next morning. The ranch watched them go, not with the watchful anxiety of Hale's departure, but with the odd, anticlimactic quality of a moment that should feel more decisive than it did. Ruth said, 6 months to a year. "More waiting," Georgina said. "Different kind," Ruth said. "That's something." It was. Georgina understood it when she turned from the gate and looked back at the Circle W. The plain-kept main house, the bunkhouses, the kitchen building with its smoke, the garden that was past its summer peak but still productive, the east bunkhouse yard where Eliza was already setting up for the morning school session, even though the children weren't out yet because Eliza treated the preparation as part of the work and had apparently always been that way about things she cared about. Vera was at the laundry line. Dodd was at the barn. Joseph was talking to the gray horse. None of it had been resolved. There was still Hale. There would be a review, and reviews had outcomes that were not guaranteed, and the Beaumont connection was a thread that had been pulled but not finished unraveling, and the legal protection afforded by the new charter was real but untested, and Grace had said very accurately that Hale could still hurt people if he was careful about how he did it. All of that was true. But Whitmore was standing at the gate with his hand on the fence post, watching the oversight men's horses shrink into the distance, and the set of his shoulders was different from how they'd been the morning Hale arrived with 7 men. Not relieved, not triumphant, but present in a different way. Like a man who has been waiting for a blow that might or might not come, and has finally been told, "Not today." Georgina walked to where he was standing. She didn't plan what she was going to say. What she said was, "You built something that was worth fighting for." He looked at the gate. He looked at his hand on the fence post. He said, "We." She thought about that, about the contract on a street in Sweetwater Creek, and Grace adding a clause in pencil, and 11 days reorganizing records, and Ruth's letter, and Margaret Olt's 18 months of quiet, careful documentation, and Vera saying I'm staying before anyone else did, and Joseph watching the road. "We," she agreed. He looked at her then. Not the brief checking-in glance he used in conversation, but a longer look, the kind that had something at stake in it, something that had been building, she thought, for longer than either of them had acknowledged, in the space between two people who'd been working through something hard together, and had, along the way, learned exactly what the other one was made of. Neither of them said anything else. The morning had things in it that needed doing, and they both knew it, and after another moment they walked back toward the ranch, not quite together, not quite apart, with the particular distance of two people who had not yet figured out what to do with what they now understood about each other, but who were at least walking in the same direction. The 6 months the oversight officer had promised turned out to be 7, which was close enough to accurate that no one complained about the difference. They were 7 months of ordinary life conducted under the awareness that ordinary life was not guaranteed, which gave everything a particular quality, not dread exactly, but a kind of deliberateness. The way people move through a house they know they might have to leave, touching things with more attention than usual. The morning routines, the evening meals, the school sessions in the East Bunkhouse yard, the accounting room with its reorganized ledgers and Grace's expanding governance documentation for the new charter entity. All of it continued, and all of it had underneath it the low persistent frequency of people who understood that continuation was not something you could take for granted and had decided to do it anyway. Hale did not come back in those 7 months. He sent 2 letters, one in October, one in January, both addressed to Whitmore through official channels, both in the formal language of a man who was still asserting authority he'd been told to stop asserting, which the lawyer in Austin described as posturing, and which Whitmore described, more precisely, as a man who couldn't afford to let the record show he'd stopped trying. Grace filed both letters in the correspondence archive under a tab she labeled, with characteristic understatement, ongoing. The Beaumont connection moved through the federal review process with the speed of a thing that was too well documented to be dismissed and too politically inconvenient to be resolved quickly. By November, 2 of the fraudulent land transfers had been flagged for investigation by the county court in Brazos County. By December, Beaumont had retained a lawyer of his own, which was the surest possible sign that the flagging had teeth. Ruth, who received regular letters from Margaret Ailt in Caldwell County, reported each development to Whitmore in the same tone she used to report supply deliveries: factual, complete, without editorial comment, which was its own kind of editorial comment. Through all of it, Georgina worked. She'd moved from general ranch labor into a role she hadn't been assigned so much as grown into, something between operations management and the particular human intelligence work of knowing which people on the ranch needed what and making sure what they needed was available before they had to ask for it. She'd learned this partly from watching Ruth, who'd been doing it for years, and partly from the specific education of having been, not long ago, the person who needed things and was waiting to see if anyone would notice. She and Whitmore talked more as the months passed. It happened naturally, in the way that proximity and shared work tend to generate conversation between people who've stopped performing their good qualities at each other and are just being what they are. They talked about the ranch and its problems, which were constant and varied, and sometimes exhausting. They talked about the people on it. They talked occasionally about things that had nothing to do with the ranch, a book Whitmore had read, a letter Georgina had received from a woman in Sweetwater Creek who'd been at the auction and had written, 7 months later, to say that she was sorry she hadn't done anything and hoped Georgina was well. They talked about that letter for a long time one evening, about what it meant and whether it meant anything practical, and whether an apology that came 7 months after the fact and from a safe distance had any real value, and they didn't agree on the answer, which was fine. They disagreed about things fairly regularly, and the disagreements had the quality of exchanges between people who expected to come to a conclusion rather than a winner, which was different from most arguments Georgina had participated in before. Whitmore listened when she pushed back on something. She'd learned to understand when his silence meant he was still processing versus when it meant he'd already decided and wasn't going to be moved, which were different silences with different textures, and learning to tell them apart had taken most of the autumn. She knew she was in love with him before she'd named it, in the way you sometimes know the shape of something before you have the word for it. It arrived as a fact rather than a discovery. She simply understood one morning in December, watching him at the breakfast table reading a letter with the focused attention he gave all reading, that this was what this was, and that it had probably been this for some time, and that she was going to have to decide what to do about it. She decided initially to do nothing, which was the practical decision given that she was technically still a contracted employee working off a debt, and he was the man who held the contract, and the particular power imbalance in that arrangement made any conversation about feelings significantly more complicated than the feelings themselves. Grace, who noticed most things, noticed this. "You're thinking about Whitmore," she said one evening in January, with the directness she used for things she'd been patient about for long enough. Georgina didn't insult her by pretending she didn't know what Grace meant. "Yes." "And?" "And it's complicated." "Everything is complicated," Grace said. "That's not a reason. That's a description." She looked at the ceiling in her thinking posture. "The debt is almost paid off. By my calculation, 6 more weeks of credited labor and we're clear." Georgina hadn't done that calculation. She had been, she realized, not doing that calculation deliberately, which was its own kind of information. "I know," she said. "After that," Grace said, "the contractual element of the situation is resolved. What's left is just people." "Just people," Georgina said, "is not a simple thing." "No," Grace agreed, "but it's the right kind of complicated." She didn't say anything else about it because Grace understood that naming a thing was enough, and pressing further was the error that turned useful observation into interference. The federal oversight ruling came in February, on a Tuesday, in a letter that Whitmore received at the breakfast table and read with the same composed attention he brought to all official correspondence, and then sat down and looked at the wall for a long moment. "Well?" Ruth said. He picked the letter up and read the relevant section aloud. Victor Hale had been formally censured by the Federal Marshal's Oversight Office for exceeding his statutory authority in 3 documented instances, one of which included the August inspection of the Circle W. He had been required to appear before a federal review board. His district authority had been suspended pending a formal determination of fitness. A temporary marshal had been appointed to the district. The connection to Beaumont had resulted in a separate proceeding, an investigation by the Brazos County Court into improper processing of land transfer documents, with Beaumont named as a party, and 2 county clerks, one of whom was Margaret Olt's husband, named as persons of interest. The fraudulent transfers had been flagged for potential reversal. One of the families who'd lost land was being contacted by the court. Whitmore set the letter down. Dodd, who was at the table, said, "That's it then?" "That's the beginning of it," Whitmore said. "The actual proceedings will take time. Hale's suspension isn't removal. The land reversals aren't final." He looked around the table. "But the federal record exists now, officially. And Hale can't use his office against this ranch without that record being part of the context." Ruth poured herself more coffee. "What about the Brazos families?" "The lawyer will follow that process. If land is restored, it's restored. If not..." He stopped. "It's not a clean ending. It's the right direction." The table was quiet for a moment. Then Vera said from the end of it, "It's enough." She said it simply, without drama, in the tone of someone who'd learned the difference between enough and everything and understood that the gap between them, while real, didn't have to be the measure of whether something mattered. After breakfast, Georgina went to find Whitmore at the fence line where he'd gone after the meal, as he sometimes did when he needed to do something with his hands while his mind worked. He was replacing a rotted post section with a focused physical attention that said he'd been at it for a while. She stood nearby for a moment before speaking. "You thought this day might not come," she said. He drove the post brace in with a mallet. "I thought it might come too late to matter." "It didn't." "No." He set the mallet down and looked at the post. "Calvert is still gone. Wherever he and his sister are, they're there without any of this catching up to them." He looked at the fence line. "That's what I think about." "I know," she said. "But the next person who might have been Calvert, they have a better chance now." He was quiet. "You can carry what you got wrong," she said, "and still understand that what you got right matters. They're not in competition with each other." He looked at her. The February light was thin and honest, the kind that didn't flatter anything, and she was aware of being looked at in it the same way she was aware of the cold in the air, as a simple fact of where she was and what was around her. He had the expression of a man who was calculating something that had nothing to do with fence posts. "The debt is paid off in 6 weeks, he said. She hadn't told him she'd known that. "Grace told you." "Grace gave me the updated ledger." He looked back at the fence. "After that, your contract is fulfilled. You and your sisters are free to go or stay as you choose, on whatever terms you choose." "I know," she said. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not with decoration. not with preamble, just the fact of it, stated in the same direct register he used for everything important. I want you to stay, and I want... He stopped. Tried again, with the particular care of someone who doesn't say things carelessly and is therefore slower at saying things that matter. I've been trying to figure out how to say this without it being complicated by the situation, by the contract and the debt and all of it, and I don't think I can wait for all of that to not be a factor anymore, because it's always going to have been a factor, and I'd rather just say it honestly and let you do what you want with it. The wind moved through the cedar scrub at the edge of the property. Somewhere in the yard behind them, one of the children yelled something at another child in the tone of a long-running argument about rules. Georgina said, "You could have just bought me. At the auction. That was the straightforward transaction." He looked at her. "But you didn't," she said. "You bought all three of us and gave us a contract with fair terms and let Grace add a clause in pencil in the middle of a street." She looked at the fence post he'd been working on. "You've been honest about everything since the first morning. I don't think you know how rare that is." She paused. "I'm not going anywhere, and not because of the contract." He said nothing for a moment. What he did was reach out and take her hand, not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, just took it in his, which was a large hand and a calloused one, and was, at that moment, exactly what she needed to know was real. They stood at the fence line in the thin February light, not saying much, because they were both people who understood that some things didn't need language to be true. The formal debt settlement happened in the third week of March, when Grace presented Whitmore with the final reconciled ledger showing zero balance on the contracted obligation, and he signed the release document that the Austin lawyer had prepared, and Grace notarized it herself, because the new charter gave her authority to do so, and she had been waiting for the opportunity to use that authority on exactly this. Eliza came to the signing with flowers she'd cut from the kitchen garden, early spring things, not grand, slightly ragged from the wind, and put them in a jar on the accounting room desk, which was so entirely Eliza that both her sisters had to look at the ceiling for a moment. "We're clear," Grace said, setting the signed document in its file. "You're clear," Whitmore said. "We're staying," Eliza said. "I have 14 students now, and 3 of them are almost ready for long division, and I'm not stopping." Whitmore looked at Eliza with the expression he sometimes got around her, which was the expression of a man who'd expected capable people and had gotten, additionally and unexpectedly, people who made the place better in ways he hadn't thought to plan for. "All right," he said. "I want a proper school space," Eliza said. "Not the bunkhouse yard, something with a roof and a board." "I'll talk to the men about it." "I'd like to talk to them myself," she said, "about what I actually need." He accepted this without debate also. He was getting better at that. The schoolroom was built in April, with lumber ordered through the supply account and labor provided by 3 of the ranch hands who'd been told by Eliza exactly what she needed and had produced it, with some back and forth about the window placement that Eliza won on the grounds that she was the one who'd be in the room all day, and she needed light from the south. It was a single room with 4 rows of proper benches and a board mounted on the east wall, and a shelf for the books that Eliza had been accumulating since the winter, through a combination of purchased copies and donated ones from correspondents she'd written to across 3 counties. The morning it was finished, Eliza stood in the empty room for a long moment before the children came in. Georgina had come to see it, and stood in the doorway watching her youngest sister stand in the new wood smell of it, with the south light coming in exactly where she'd said it needed to come, and she thought about Eliza at 15 on the auction block, with her fists at her sides and her lower lip pressed white, and about how the distance between that moment and this one was 7 months of work and held breath and practical courage and one man's decision to ride a day and a half to stop something wrong from happening. She thought about how much had depended on that ride, and she thought about how many things depended on decisions like that one, decisions that cost something, that were made without knowing how they'd end, that no one might ever notice if they weren't made, but whose consequences radiated outward for years if they were. Eliza turned and saw her in the doorway and said, "Come in. The light's good." It was. Spring at the Circle. W had a different quality than the previous summer. Not easier. The work was the same work. The problems were the problems of any large operation with a lot of people and a lot of moving parts and resources that never quite matched need. The Hale situation wasn't resolved so much as transformed. He remained suspended pending his review board, and the district's temporary marshal was a careful man who gave the Circle W no trouble, and the federal record existed in the way that records exist, not preventing future harm, but making it harder to commit without consequence. Beaumont's situation moved through the Brazos County Court with the speed of a legal process that had good evidence and reluctant participants, and no one particularly eager to reach a conclusion. Two of the families whose land had been fraudulently transferred received formal notice that their claims were under review. Whether the land would actually be restored was a question the court hadn't answered yet, and might not answer for another year. Margaret Alt, who had continued corresponding with Ruth through all of it, sent a letter in April saying that her husband had given a full statement to the court investigators, and that she was both relieved and terrified, which Ruth said was the most honest summary of the situation she'd heard. The families who'd sent children to the Circle W, the ones who'd placed their kids there because their own circumstances had made it impossible to keep them. Two more came back in the spring and reclaimed their children.
Reunions of that kind had a particular texture. Not clean, not simple, full of things that had happened in the interval that couldn't be undone, but real, with the specific realness of people finding each other again after circumstances had separated them. Whitmore documented both reunions in the ledger with his spare handwriting. Georgina watched him do it and thought about what he'd said at the fence line months before. If I write it down, it happened, and understood it differently now. It wasn't just about preventing things from being erased. It was about insisting that people's lives had weight, that what happened to them was worth recording, that they had been here, and it had mattered. Joseph did not have family who came for him. He was 15 now, and he'd been at the Circle W for 3 years, and what he had in that time had become the life he actually lived, rather than the place he'd been put while his real life waited somewhere else. He understood this, or was coming to understand it, in the way you come to understand things that are simultaneously a loss and the shape of where you actually are. He was working the horses full-time now, with a knowledge and a feel for the animals that had outpaced the ranch hands within the first year and had kept going. Whitmore had begun paying him a proper wage in February, which Joseph had received with a seriousness that was almost funny and was also completely right, because being taken seriously at the level of your actual competence is one of the things that makes a person real to themselves. Vera's husband never came. The desertion claim in Brazos County was formally dismissed in May, 3 weeks after Beaumont's legal troubles made it politically inconvenient for his allies in that county to pursue anything that might draw additional federal scrutiny to their record-keeping. The dismissal arrived in a letter that was 3 sentences long and used language that implied the claim had been without merit from the beginning, which was a particular kind of institutional dishonesty that Vera read with a short, humorless sound that acknowledged what the letter was and wasn't saying. She put it in her own folder, in her own box, which she kept under her bunk, where she kept everything that had to do with the documented proof that she and her children were legally themselves and legally free. "Done," she said to Georgina that evening. "Done," Georgina agreed. Vera looked at the ceiling. "I keep waiting for the relief to feel bigger. How does it feel?" Like, she thought about it. Like setting something heavy down. You don't feel light, exactly. You just feel what you actually weigh without it. She looked at her hands. That's enough. Georgina thought about that for a long time afterward, about what enough meant and how it was different from everything, and how the distance between them was often where people actually lived, not in triumph, not in loss, but in the middle ground where ordinary life happened, and where, if you paid attention, there was more than you'd thought. Caleb Whitmore proposed to Georgina Fraser on a morning in June that was not special in any visible way, not a significant date, not a notable occasion, just a Tuesday morning when they were both at the fence line after breakfast, because there was always something at the fence line, and they had both over the past months developed the habit of going there. He said, "I'd like to marry you." Not "will you marry me," which is a question, but the flat, direct statement of a man naming something true. "If you're willing." She'd known it was coming, not from any specific signal, but from the particular way two people move toward each other when they've stopped pretending they aren't, which has a kind of inevitability that is not passive. It requires continuous small choices, daily decisions to stay present to each other, but which has, from the outside and eventually from the inside too, the quality of something that was always going to happen. She said, "I'm willing." He said, "We'll do it right, legal, documented, witnessed." A pause.
Grace will want to review the terms. She laughed. It came out of her before she could shape it into anything more dignified, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her, and his mouth moved in the way it moved when he was genuinely pleased about something but hadn't quite decided to show it fully. She will, Georgina agreed, and she'll add a clause. In pencil, he said. Probably in ink by now, she said. She's getting more confident. They got married in July, in the yard of the Circle W, on a Saturday morning that was hot the way Texas July is always hot, and was not going to be anything other than that. Ruth had organized it with the efficiency she brought to all operations and the additional warmth she kept for things she actually cared about. Eliza had made something with the kitchen garden flowers, a real arrangement more considered than the ragged jar of March, evidence of months of practice. And the whole ranch had turned out in the good clothes they saved for serious occasions, which meant the yard had a particular quality of people who didn't usually look like this looking like this, which was both slightly formal and deeply human. Grace, who officiated because the ranch's charter authorized her to, and because there was no one else Georgina would have wanted, kept the ceremony short and honest. She said what was true, that these were two people who had come to know each other through hard work and difficult circumstances, who had seen what the other was made of in conditions that didn't allow for pretending, and who had decided with full information and without illusion that they wanted to continue doing this together. Whitmore said "I do" with the same quality of voice he used for all important statements. Not theatrical, not flat, just true. Georgina said it the same way. Grace signed the document and Ruth witnessed it, and Joseph, standing in the back of the gathered crowd with his good hat on and his hands in his pockets, watched with an expression that was the expression of someone who was genuinely moved and didn't entirely know what to do with that. After it was done and the morning moved into the meal, Ruth and Cass and two of the other women had prepared a real meal, the kind that required work the day before and the morning of. Georgina stood for a moment at the edge of the yard and looked at the Circle W, the main house with its plain-kept exterior, the bunkhouses, the schoolroom Eliza had fought for and gotten, the kitchen building with its perpetual smoke, the garden past its early summer peak and into the serious productive middle of the season, the barn where Joseph was probably talking to the gray horse even now, in the brief interval between the ceremony and the meal, the children running through the yard in their good clothes, already pulling at collars and hems, reverting to their actual selves at the speed of children who'd been asked to be still for 20 minutes. It was not a beautiful place in the aesthetic sense. It had been built for function and added to as need arose and repaired when things broke and would need repairing again, because that was what places were. Ongoing projects, not finished products. The people in it were not uncomplicated. They had histories that had cost them things, and those costs didn't disappear because they'd found somewhere safe, and the safety itself was not absolute and never would be. Hale's formal review was still pending. The Beaumont proceedings were still underway. The temporary marshal was reasonable but temporary. The world outside the Circle W's fence line was the same world it had always been, with the same capacity for the specific human cruelties that happened when people with power decided that other people's lives were theirs to arrange. But the records in the accounting room documented 26 adults and 14 children currently in residence at the Circle W Community Trust, which was what the charter entity was called, the name Grace had chosen with the care she gave everything important. 26 adults and 14 children who had somewhere to be, who were accounted for, who had their names written down in a ledger maintained by a woman who understood that documentation was a form of insisting that people existed and that what happened to them mattered. Two of those 26 adults were Grace Frazier, who had walked into a lawyer's office in her best dress and been told no, and had said fine. Then I'll find a different mechanism, and had found it, and had built a governance structure for a community organization on the Texas frontier that was now a matter of federal record. And Eliza Frazier, who was 15 months ago on an auction block with her fists clenched, and was today a teacher with 14 students and a south-facing window and a shelf of books accumulated through her own persistent effort. And one of them was Georgina Frazier Whitmore, who had stood on that same auction block and made a promise to herself that she would not cry. Not because crying was weakness, but because she had decided that her grief was not Sweetwater Creek's entertainment, and who had kept that promise, and who had been learning ever since what she was actually capable of, when the circumstances and the people around her made capability possible. She thought about her father, which she did less often now, but still did. About his debts and his storytelling and his careless relationship with money and his genuine warmth, which had been real and had also not been enough. She had spent a long time being angry at him. Not the hot anger, but the cold kind,
the kind that settled into the place where a person you loved used to be. And she didn't think she was finished with that anger. But she understood something about it now that she hadn't before. The anger and the love were not in competition. They could both be true. He had been what he was, and it had cost them terribly. And he had also been their father, and she had loved him. And both of those things were going to be true for the rest of her life. And the task was not to resolve them, but to carry them both without letting either one become the only story. That was something Caleb had taught her, without meaning to, by the example of how he carried his own history. The war, the failures, the margin note that said, "Don't know if voluntary." He didn't try to undo what had happened. He just kept going. He kept the gate open. He kept the records. He kept trying to make the next situation better than the last one, with the specific stubbornness of a man who'd decided that the fact that you couldn't fix everything was not a reason to stop fixing what you could. She had married a man who was not easy and not simple, and who was carrying things he'd probably never be entirely free of, and who didn't expect her to fix those things for him, and who in return did not expect to fix anything for her. What they had was something else. A working partnership, a genuine friendship, the specific trust that comes from watching someone behave well when it would have been easier not to. It was not a romantic story in the sense that romance usually meant. It was something harder and more durable. Whitmore appeared beside her. He handed her a cup of something cold that Ruth had made, and stood next to her looking at the yard. "You're thinking," he said. "I do that," she said. "What about?" She looked at the yard, at Grace, who was talking to the lawyer's representative who'd attended the wedding as a courtesy, talking with the focused attention of someone who'd spotted a professional opportunity in a social occasion and was pursuing it without embarrassment. At Eliza, who'd somehow gathered 4 of the younger children around her in the middle of a wedding reception and appeared to be telling them something they were paying close attention to, which meant she was probably already conducting a lesson. At Vera, standing with Cass and 2 other women in the shade of the main house, laughing at something with the ease of people who'd been through something hard together and come out the other side still in each other's company. At Joseph, who had come back from the barn and was standing at the edge of the group eating something off a plate with the careful attention of a boy who'd learned not to waste food and probably always would eat that way, which was fine, which was one of the small marks that experience leaves on a person and which didn't need to be fixed. "About what enough looks like," she said, "when you're in it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the same thing she was looking at. "Like this," he said. She thought about that, about the improbability of the specific chain of events that had produced this particular July morning. Her father's debts, the auction, one man on a gray horse, a contract with a penciled clause, 11 days reorganizing records, Margaret Alt's 18 months of quiet documentation, a federal ruling, a charter, a schoolroom with a south-facing window. How many things had to happen, and in what order, and because of what decisions by which people, for this morning to exist. It was the kind of calculation that could make you dizzy if you looked at it directly, or you could just look at the yard. "Like this," she agreed. The years that followed were not a fairy tale and were not meant to be one. The Hale Review concluded in September with a finding that stripped him of his marshal's commission and barred him from federal law enforcement permanently, which was justice in the legal sense and was not the same as the undoing of every harm he'd caused and was not pretending to be. The Beaumont land case wound through the courts for another 2 years. In the end, one family recovered their parcel and one did not, and the second outcome was unfair and left a mark on everyone who'd been involved in the effort, because that is what unfair outcomes do, and there was no version of the truth that made it not so. The Circle W Community Trust became, over the following years, something that other people knew about, not famous, not celebrated, but known, in the specific way that a place becomes known when it does what it says it does, and the people who've been through it tell other people. The Austin lawyer referred 2 families to them in the second year. A minister in a neighboring county sent a letter asking if they'd be willing to talk to a group he was trying to help, and Whitmore wrote back saying they didn't involve themselves in religious organizations, but he'd be glad to share what he knew about the legal structure of the trust. 3 ranchers in Holt County who'd been watching the Hale situation donated supplies the winter after the ruling, not as charity. They were careful about the word, but as one of them put it, an investment in the kind of neighbor they wanted to have.
The charter's governance structure, which Grace had built with the precision she brought to all mechanisms she believed in, held up under the pressure of growth. She expanded the board to include 2 community representatives elected by the residents themselves, a process she designed and documented so thoroughly that it could be run the same way by anyone, which was the point. She developed a financial model that made the trust less dependent on Whitmore's personal resources, which was also the point. She was offered a position with a law firm in Austin in the 3rd year, a legitimate offer from serious people, and she thought about it for 3 weeks and turned it down, which surprised almost everyone who knew her except Georgina, who understood that Grace had found something more interesting to build than a career. Eliza's school grew. She had 22 students by the 2nd year and wrote to a women's college in the East asking about correspondence curricula for her older students, and received in return not only the curricula, but a letter from a professor who was interested in what she was doing and wanted to visit, who came and spent a week in the schoolroom and left having donated a box of books and a promise to send more. 3 of Eliza's students from those early years became teachers themselves. She knew this because they wrote to her, and she kept their letters, and on the days when teaching was hard, which was regularly, because it was always hard, because children were complicated and resources were limited, and some days she was exhausted before noon, she read a few of them. She never married, though there were 2 men over the years who asked and whom she liked and considered seriously. She simply found, each time, that what she was already doing was the thing she wanted most, and she trusted that finding. Vera stayed. Her children grew up at the Circle W and went, eventually, into the world. One to a trade in Houston, one to a marriage in a neighboring county, and Vera stayed and became, over time, the person new arrivals were most likely to be introduced to first, because she understood what it felt like to come to a place with nothing but the hope that it might be what it said it was, and she could tell you, from where she stood, that it was. Joseph turned 18 in the 4th year, and Whitmore offered to formalize his employment as head of the horse operation with a wage and a percentage that was real money. Joseph said he'd like to think about it, which Whitmore said was fine, and Joseph came back 2 days later and said yes, but he wanted it written into the contract that he had authority to refuse any horse trade he considered unethical, which Whitmore said yes to without debate, because he would have said yes to that from the beginning, and he thought Joseph probably knew that and had asked anyway because asking mattered, because knowing your own terms mattered, because being the kind of person who named what they needed was something that Joseph had had to learn against the grain of everything that had happened to him before the Circle W. And he was learning it, and Whitmore was not going to be the obstacle to that. Georgina and Whitmore had 2 children, a boy and a girl, born in the 3rd and 5th years. The children grew up on the ranch the way children grow up on ranches, by practical, a little wild, with the particular education that comes from being around a lot of different kinds of people from an early age, and learning that the world contains more variation than any one family could account for. They knew the names of everyone on the trust. They knew how the ledgers worked because Grace explained it to them. They went to Aunt Eliza's school. The boy was frightened of horses until he was 7, and Joseph spent a patient, unannounced 2 weeks introducing him to the gray horse's foal at his own pace, and after that was not frightened anymore. The girl asked, at age 6, why there were so many people at their ranch who weren't family, and Georgina told her, because some people need somewhere to be, and we have somewhere, and so they're here, and after enough time here, they're family. The girl thought about this and said, how do you know when it's enough time? Georgina thought about the auction block in Sweetwater Creek, and the contract with the penciled clause, and 11 days of records, and a federal ruling, and a schoolroom with a south-facing window, and a Tuesday morning at the fence line in February. You know, she said, when you stop asking, there is a thing that happens when people survive the kind of situation the Fraser sisters survived. They become, in the telling, symbols of resilience, of courage, of the human capacity to endure. The story gets cleaned up. The fear goes away. The exhaustion goes away. The specific humiliation of standing on a platform in the sun while men looked at you like livestock. That goes away too, replaced by something tidier and more instructive. But the real thing was messier than that, and more ordinary, and more human, and in its humanity more worth the telling. The real thing was 3 women who were imperfect and frightened and sometimes at each other's nerves, and who made 1,000 small unglamorous decisions, most of which weren't brave in any recognizable way, but which, accumulated, amounted to survival and then to more than survival, It was a man who was also imperfect, who had failures in his past he was still accounting for, who kept records because records were the only proof he'd found that things could be made to matter. It was Ruth, with her efficiency and her bottle saved for the right occasion, and Vera, who stayed and understood what enough meant, and Joseph, who learned to ask for his own terms, and Eliza, who taught 22 children how to think because she believed that thinking was what people deserved the chance to do. The real thing was that none of them were saved. Not in the way stories usually mean saving. What happened was that a set of conditions made it possible for people who needed to rebuild, and that the conditions were not accidental, were not luck, were not the intervention of some force that had decided these particular people deserved good things. The conditions were made by work, by documentation, by the specific stubbornness of people who decided that the law was a tool and they were going to learn to use it, by the ordinary daily courage of people who kept showing up for something they believed in, even when showing up was hard. That is not a more modest version of the story. It is a more demanding one, because luck releases you from responsibility. Conditions that are made ask what you're making and whether you're making it deliberately, and who else's life depends on the quality of what you build. The Circle W Community Trust stood for decades after the summer of 1873. It changed shape over the years, as things that survive must change. It responded to what was needed, expanded what was working, stopped what wasn't. Some people who came through it went on to build other things in other places, and some of those things lasted and some didn't, and the lasting and the not lasting were both part of what it meant to try. The ledgers Grace kept, in her small, precise script, documented all of it. Who came and when and what they'd needed and what had been possible. Who'd stayed and who'd moved on and what they'd done after. Who'd been afraid and who'd been angry and who'd been both at once, which was most people, most of the time. On the last page of the first ledger, below the final entry for the summer of 1873, which was a notation about the Fraser sisters' debt clearance and the formal establishment of the trust, Grace had written, in the same script she used for all the entries, something that was not accounting and not legal and not part of any document she'd been asked to produce. She'd written, "People who have been through hard things do not automatically become good because of it, but they become specific. They know what matters because they have lived in conditions that made it impossible to pretend otherwise. What you do with that knowledge is the only question that remains. It was not addressed to anyone. It was not signed. It was written because Grace wrote things down when she wanted to remember them clearly, and this was something she wanted to remember. The ledger stayed in the accounting room on the properly labeled shelf for as long as the room and the shelf and the building stood, and the Circle W kept its gate open.